Do you believe that time and love heal all wounds? Julia Carter left the courtroom with a weight on her shoulders that seemed impossible to carry. New York was buzzing around her with its chaotic traffic and the insistent sound of horns. But none of that could distract from the anguish that consumed her. After nearly a decade of marriage, she was officially divorced. What had once been her forever was now limited to signed papers, where she left with custody of Max, her 7-year-old son, and the responsibility of going it alone. He had no job, much less savings, and the division of his assets was far from fair. The agreement, proposed as reasonable by her ex-husband's lawyer, left her with more debts than resources. Julia tried to control her emotions, took a deep breath and grabbed Max's hand tightly, who kept asking about the next adventure they would have together. But at that moment, what Julia could least see was the possibility of adventure. As she walked down the street, pulling Max by the hand, Julia mentally calculated her options. The tiny apartment he had found was far from Max's school, in a neighborhood he had never considered living in. The outstanding bills were a constant reminder that time was running out, and she desperately needed a plan. Throughout her marriage, she had dedicated herself to being a mother and wife, and had not worked a formal job for years. Without references or recent experience, the job market seemed like a daunting barrier. With a heavy heart, she realized she needed an immediate solution. That night, after putting Max to bed, Julia sat on the couch with her old laptop and started looking for alternatives. Of all the options, working as an app driver seemed the most viable and quickest. She could control her schedule, pick up Max from school, and the rental car through the app was an affordable solution, even if her budget was tight. Although the thought of driving the streets of New York seemed a little intimidating, she knew she needed to be practical. Max counted on her, and that was enough to push her forward. The next morning, Julia put on the app's uniform t-shirt and a light coat, as the forecast was for rain. It was her first day, and eager to get off to a good start, she spent extra time reviewing the routes on her cell phone. After dropping Max off at school, she took a deep breath, grabbed the steering wheel firmly, and started her first shift. The first few runs were successful, if tiring, and Julia felt cautious relief in realizing that maybe this could work, at least temporarily. However, at noon, she received a call from the school. Max had had a small anxiety attack and wanted his mother. Feeling her heart race, Julia quickly ended the race and drove to school. Shrouded in a mixture of guilt and worry, she found him curled up in the reception area, hugging his body. Her presence reassured him, but she knew Max was suffering from all the changes, even if he tried not to show it. She decided to take him with her, hoping that he would be distracted and spend the rest of the day in her company. He settled into the back seat with a sketchbook as she prepared to continue her shift. In the early afternoon, traffic became a real test of patience. The traffic lights seemed to conspire against Julia, who tried to keep her attention on the route and talk to Max, who asked questions about the places they passed. It was in this scenario that everything went wrong. While trying to adjust the GPS and answer a question from Max, she noticed too late that the light had changed, and when trying to brake to avoid a cyclist, she lost control of the car, swerving sharply to the side. The sound of metal clashing was loud and instantaneous. Julia froze, her heart beating uncontrollably, while Max in the back seat asked in fear what had happened. As soon as she realized they were okay, Julia got out of the car, her legs shaking. In front of him was a shiny black BMW with a considerable dent on the side. Before she could react, a tall, well-dressed man got out of the car, visibly irritated. "Do you know what you did?" His voice was controlled, but there was an icy tone to each word. Julia, still processing the impact, tried to apologize, but he just interrupted her, clearly out of patience. The man, who looked like something out of a business magazine, placed his hands on his hips, assessing the damage to the car. He had a restrained expression, as if he was controlling himself from exploding. Julia realized that she was at a disadvantage, not only because of her financial condition, but also because of the stranger's imposing posture. Nervously, she began to explain that it had been a momentary distraction, that she had her son in the back seat, but nothing seemed to alleviate the situation. After a few minutes, The man looked at her with sharp eyes and a tone of disdain, as if he was evaluating everything about her in a second. "This is a luxury car, and it will be expensive to fix. How do you intend to pay?" Julia felt her face burn with shame and fear. Any excuse seemed insignificant in that look. With her rental car and her bank account practically empty, the honest answer was that she couldn't afford it. Swallowing her pride, she confessed her situation, hoping he would have at least a little understanding. But instead, he let out a dry laugh and shook his head. "Look, honestly, I don't have time for this. If you can't pay, then we'll need to resolve it another way," he said, with a practical and impatient tone. Julia fell silent, fighting her rising panic. The man then gave him a calculating look, as if considering an alternative. "What is your job?" The question took Julia by surprise. How to explain that? Until yesterday, she was just a housewife desperately trying to rebuild her life. Hesitantly, she told him about the ride-hailing job she had started, omitting the painful details of the divorce. The man seemed to consider that for a moment before crossing his arms, his gaze still assessing every detail of her. "You're responsible for the accident, but since you don't seem to be able to pay, here's what we're going to do," he declared coldly. "I need a temporary personal assistant. The work is simple but demanding. It will help me until it covers the cost of the damage. If you don't accept it, I will have no choice but to take you to justice. And you know, it will be worse for you." The proposal surprised him, as if he also didn't believe what he had just said. However, the man remained unshakable, with an expression of superiority that seemed to be his trademark. Julia, cornered, with Max holding her hand, realized that she was facing an almost impossible decision. She needed that temporary job to cover the bills and, above all, avoid a lawsuit. "Okay, I accept," she said, feeling helpless, but with a slight hope that this would be the solution to her most pressing problems. The man noted the response with a slight nod, as if he had expected this reaction. "Excellent. We start tomorrow. My name is Adam Grayson. Be at my company at 8 o'clock sharp. No delays," he said, before turning and disappearing through the car door, with a coldness that left Julia unsure what to think. When he left, Julia took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline subside, but with a lump in her throat. Max looked at her with a worried expression, and she smiled as best she could, trying to look confident. As much as the situation was a disaster, this was an opportunity, even if it was shrouded in tension and uncertainty. Back at the apartment, Julia felt reality weighing down on her shoulders. Adam Grayson, the man she would now work for, seemed to be a controlling person with a difficult temper. But at the same time, that unexpected incident might have been his chance to start over. She knew she would have to swallow her pride and adapt to the new work environment, but she would do her best to make it work for Max and for herself. That night, before going to sleep, Julia revisited the moment of the collision countless times, wondering if she could have done anything differently. She tried to guess what awaited her the next day, a business world she knew nothing about, and which would now be her new territory. Silently, she promised herself that she would do her best, because deep down, she knew that Max's future depended on it. Julia woke up with a mixture of nervousness and determination. The memory of the previous day still hovered like a confusing nightmare. The noise of the accident, Adam Grayson's cold gaze, and his unyielding proposal. Now she found herself involved with a man who had left her with no choice and who seemed far from kindness. At that moment, the weight of the decision was overwhelming, but Julia knew she needed to keep her promise to ensure an income, even if it meant entering the hostile territory of someone who clearly had no empathy for her situation. Looking in the mirror, she made one last adjustment to the dress shirt she had found in the back of her closet, trying to look professional. Adam's company, Grayson Tech, was located in one of the most imposing buildings in downtown New York. Upon arriving, Julia stood paralyzed for a moment, absorbing the frantic movement of people entering and exiting with determined steps. Dressed in impeccable suits, as if each person there had an essential mission, she felt her stomach drop. It was impossible to fit in there, but the memory of Adam's incisive gaze kept her going. As soon as she entered the reception, an employee looked at her with an analytical expression, looking her up and down. Julia Carter?" asked the woman without any sympathy. Julia confirmed with a nod, and the receptionist offered her an access card and directed her to the elevator. "Mr. Grayson is waiting for you on the top floor. Don't be late." Julia took a deep breath as she entered the elevator, feeling her heart beat faster with each floor. The idea of having to face Adam again caused him deep discomfort, but also growing irritation. He seemed to embody everything she resented most: immense wealth, arrogance, and impenetrable coldness. When the elevator doors opened, she found herself in a modern, almost impersonal office. The glass walls allowed for a stunning view of the city, but Julia didn't have time to appreciate it. Adam was there, next to a glass table, with his gaze focused on a tablet, his fingers moving across the screen with an almost impatient speed. Without looking away from the screen, he gestured for her to enter. Julia took a hesitant step, her hands sweaty and the words slipping from her mind. He didn't seem to notice her presence immediately, and for a moment, she found herself observing his features carefully. The dark, well-cut hair, the erect posture, the calculated movements of someone always in control. Then he finally looked up, and his face was the embodiment of indifference. "First of all, I'll make it clear that I don't have time for training or dealing with basic errors," Adam said directly, with a low and precise voice that sounded more like a command. "Your job is to ensure that my demands are met, period. I don't want excuses, much less problems." Julia nodded, suppressing the urge to respond defensively. At that moment, Adam saw it as just another instrument for his needs, like any other piece within his company. Even though it offended her, she knew she had to bear it. He watched her for a second, as if gauging her every reaction. "I'll start with the basics. My appointment schedule must always be organized, and you must take care of the correspondence I receive. And when I say caring, I mean filtering it so that I don't have to deal with unnecessary things." He looked at her, waiting for an answer, and Julia again just nodded, trying to absorb all the instructions. The morning passed at an intense pace. Adam wasn't just demanding, he seemed willing to test Julia's limits from the first moment. With each assigned task, he watched her reactions, as if expecting her to make a mistake. And when that finally happened, upon handing over the day's agenda with a forgotten appointment, he didn't hesitate to make a scathing comment about his lack of attention to the basics. Julia felt her palms moisten as she tried to explain that she was still getting used to the system. He interrupted her with an icy glare. "Either you learn quickly, or you'll be out before you know it," he said, his voice so sharp that Julia felt her face burn. For a moment, she wanted to scream. He had no idea what she was going through. The desire to abandon work arose, but in a flash, Max's image and the insecurity of his financial situation came to light. Adam had no idea the weight she was carrying, and probably never would, but she swallowed hard, deciding to commit even more. Undeterred, Julia spent the next few hours in determined silence, dealing with the documents he gave her and responding to his commands with a simple yes, Mr. Grayson, without giving him any reason to criticize her. The end of the day approached, and she struggled to complete each task with precision, focused on the challenge of showing Adam that she could live up to his demands. When the clock finally indicated that the workday was ending, Julia breathed a sigh of relief, believing that she would have a moment to rest. But before she could leave, Adam called her back. "Tomorrow, I need you to arrive an hour early," he said, without any explanation. "We have an important meeting, and I want you to be prepared to take notes. Don't be late." The imperative tone and lack of consideration were frustrating, but Julia knew she had no choice. He accepted the order, while internally searching for a remnant of patience to deal with that situation. As she left the building, her thoughts were divided between the discomfort of dealing with Adam and the desire to overcome that, to build a new beginning. When picking up Max at a friend's house, who was willing to take care of him during the day, Julia felt exhausted. However, as she looked at her son smile and heard about what he had done at school, she realized that all the effort would be worth it, as long as it ensured his safety. That night, Julia was unable to rest. Thoughts of the stressful day and Adam's stiffness raced through his mind, mixed with a deep fear that he wasn't up to the challenge. But deep down she knew that the worst thing would be not to try, so she decided that she would keep her head up, even if she had to swallow every harsh word from Adam. The second day started early, and Julia arrived at the office before Adam even arrived, hoping to surprise him by being prepared. When he finally arrived, he just greeted her with a quick look and a slight wave, which she took as approval. Throughout the day, Adam assigned her to organize a series of important documents, and then asked her to accompany him to a meeting with investors. She wasn't sure what to do or say, but she remained professional and focused on her notes, trying to absorb every detail. The pace of working alongside Adam was brutal, and although she was adapting, Julia realized he had little or no interest in lightening the environment. Each instruction was direct and impersonal, and he treated it with the same coolness he showed in business meetings, as if it were a replaceable element in his routine. But she refused to give up, determined to use this challenge to prove something to herself, especially after so long depending on someone else. At the end of the meeting, Adam barely glanced at her before he started walking back to the office, and Julia found herself following in his footsteps. He seemed constantly immersed in thought, as if he were in a distant dimension, and she realized that this demanding world distanced him from any trace of sensitivity. As much as she tried not to care, a part of her wondered if Adam was really as insensitive as he appeared. However, his priority was clear: accomplish his tasks and ensure that the temporary job was a springboard to whatever his next step was. Over the next few days, Julia continued to confront Adam's bad temper and rigidity, standing firm even when he demonstrated his impatience with any slightest mistake. With each encounter, she learned more about how to deal with his personality, but also about the kind of absolute control he had over his own life. It was as if he had built an insurmountable barrier that kept any possibility of vulnerability at bay. And despite her physical and mental exhaustion, Julia began to see that challenge as an opportunity to strengthen herself and perhaps to prove that she could overcome adversity without depending on anyone. By the end of that week, Julia had a glimpse of the impact of her presence on Adam's life. He surprised her with a slight thank you, albeit brief and almost mechanical, which left her confused. In that merciless environment, any kind word seemed unexpected. Even if he didn't admit it, she was beginning to realize that her presence there was forcing him to deal with a different reality. A reality that she herself had learned to accept out of necessity and that he might never have experienced. From the first moment Julia joined Grayson Tech's daily life, the difference between Adam's world and hers was stark, a gap that seemed impossible to bridge. Everything in that glass and steel building gleamed of luxury and efficiency at a pace so relentless that it barely allowed for pauses to breathe. Julia moved between modern hallways and rooms decorated with pieces of contemporary art, with glass walls that offered an imposing view of the city. As she tried to assimilate her new surroundings, the place seemed built to intimidate, tailor-made for those suited to the grandeur and speed of that reality. Adam was clearly the center of that universe. With quick and precise steps, he controlled meetings, commanded decisions, and spoke in a tone so precise and direct that it was cutting. Julia's days now revolved around adapting to Adam's impeccable and calculated world. But the impact went beyond the opulence and sophistication around her. Every second there required her to make a conscious effort to not let her insecurity dominate her. The pressure was constant, as Adam's impatience left no room for hesitation. The level of demand from herself grew, like an invisible responsibility that weighed more and more on her shoulders. Her desk was close to Adam's office, isolated from other work areas, and this placed her close to her boss in a way that increased tension. Observing him carefully, I noticed that Adam was almost a precision machine. He never made a mistake, never hesitated in a decision, and was always aware of what was happening every second. Even the most experienced and confident employees seemed to tremble when speaking to him, always with an expression of respect mixed with fear. Julia, who until then was not used to corporate severity, began to understand why everyone followed her orders to the letter. Each new request from Adam put her on high alert. From organizing correspondence to checking and reviewing contract details, nothing went unnoticed by him. If there was a mistake, no matter how small, Adam would notice it before anyone else, and wouldn't hesitate to point out the mistake. One morning, when organizing a contract, Julia reversed a name and was corrected with a coldness that left her paralyzed. "Miss Carter, I hope you understand that every detail matters," Adam said, his gaze fixed on her. Inattention is not acceptable. She tried not to show that his words affected her, but she felt a surge of frustration and anger. "I wanted to respond, to say that I was doing my best to keep up with the intensity of that environment, but I knew that he probably wouldn't even listen to my justifications." There was no time for questions or explanations in Adam's world. With Max in mind, she took a deep breath and prepared to start again. Despite everything, Julia noticed that, as tough as her boss was, he was also incredibly attentive and observant. What he lacked in empathy, he made up for in an unrelenting presence. Ultimately, after a series of exhausting meetings, he always seemed unshakable, as if the weight of that entire empire never affected him. In the rare moments when he walked the halls, the employees fell silent and watched him with a mixture of admiration and caution. Julia had never met anyone who exercised so much control over others and, at the same time, maintained an almost cruel detachment. Before long, he began to realize that working with Adam was much more than completing tasks and following commands. It was also learning to survive in the midst of a corporate jungle where any mistake could be fatal. One day, Adam asked her to accompany him to a business meeting at an elegant restaurant, the kind of place Julia had never set foot in before. The walls were decorated with dark wood paneling, and the soft lighting provided a sophisticated and intimidating ambience. Sitting next to him, Julia tried to concentrate on her notes and ignore the suspicious looks from the investors, who seemed to question her presence there. Adam had instructed her to remain silent, writing down only the essentials, but the atmosphere was so charged that she felt every word was an implicit order for her to maintain perfect posture. Adam's tone was cool and matter-of-fact, and he dominated the conversation with such assurance that even the most experienced men seemed to hesitate before questioning him. Julia noticed how Adam used words like weapons, sharp and precise. At one point, he confronted one of the investors who was trying to modify the terms of a deal with a direct question and an implacable expression. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, and Julia realized that this was the kind of power that Adam cultivated with frightening intensity. In her mind, she struggled to understand what made someone act like this, as if life were a series of battles where the only rule was not to show weakness. When they returned to the office, Adam seemed impassive, but Julia felt exhausted, as if she had been through an emotional marathon. Being next to him in that world was like learning to breathe at a different pace, a constant struggle not to let the pressure crush you. She began to realize that as she tried to adapt to Adam's demands, something inside her was also changing. With each challenge he placed in her path, Julia felt forced to face her own limitations, and perhaps that was transforming her. A week after her first day, Adam asked her to prepare a detailed presentation for an important project. It was something she had never done before, and he didn't give clear instructions, as if he expected her to find the solution on her own. Julia spent hours researching, dedicating herself to understanding every aspect of the project to avoid any mistakes. When he finally delivered the presentation, Adam examined the document in silence, but did not show any positive reaction. "I would make some changes," he commented, before indicating some corrections without any additional guidance. Julia nodded, but felt a wave of frustration invade her chest. No matter how much she tried to please him, it seemed like it would never be enough. Adam just expected more, as if she was supposed to read his mind and meet a standard that he never explained. At night, alone in the apartment, Julia tried to understand what the job was demanding of her. The feeling of never being good enough tormented her, but she forced herself to resist, repeating to herself that she was doing it for Max. The sight of him sleeping peacefully was the only relief she found in the midst of that turmoil. Julia knew that she needed to remain firm, that each difficulty was a test that she needed to face, even if it cost her pride and the peace that had already been so shaken recently. In the days that followed, She found herself increasingly immersed in a universe where humanity seemed to disappear in favor of productivity. Adam was like a machine that expected the same relentless performance from others. He rarely left the office before 10 at night, and when he did take breaks, it was only for urgent phone calls. Julia couldn't help but wonder if this constant pace wasn't taking a toll on him. If behind the indestructible facade, he didn't feel as exhausted as she did. Over time, Julia began to realize that, despite all the pressure, she was learning something new about herself. As much as Adam seemed distant and cold to her, he was teaching her how to bear a load that before she hadn't even imagined she was capable of carrying. She became more cautious, more observant and attentive, developing a kind of internal strength that helped her face the days. Living with Adam was making her review her own potential, and even though he had no intention of helping her, his demanding behavior pushed her to go beyond her own limitations. In a moment of venting, Julia confided her exhaustion to a colleague who worked at the company's reception, an older woman who seemed to understand the weight of that environment. The colleague just smiled understandingly and said that Adam was known for being extremely demanding, but that, for anyone who managed to survive him, a door would always open. "He's tough," without a doubt commented the colleague, watching Julia with an understanding look. "But that's how he protects himself. You think he's insensitive, but believe me, that's just armor." The words stuck in Julia's head as she tried to absorb the meaning behind them. On several occasions, he began to notice that, even with Adam's coldness, there were moments when he seemed almost human. Once, at the end of a particularly tense day, she caught him looking out the window with a distant, almost vulnerable expression, as if, for a brief moment, she was letting slip something that he normally hid beneath his armor of perfection. However, doubt and exhaustion were still ever present. Julia found herself questioning how fair it was to continue there, whether it was right to put up with all that pressure for a temporary salary. But at the end of each day, when I saw Max's smile and knew that I was ensuring his livelihood, all doubts disappeared, even if momentarily. As the days passed, Julia felt a mixture of aversion and fascination towards Adam. He was an enigmatic figure, someone with a strength of will that seemed impenetrable and that challenged her in ways no one had ever challenged her before. Every time she accomplished a difficult task or endured harsh criticism, something inside her changed, as if Adam was unintentionally teaching her to be stronger, to overcome her own limits. That morning began with tension visible in the air. Julia had already learned that meeting days were even more exhausting. Adam was impatient, demanding, and with a rigidity that did not tolerate the slightest distraction. He had already gone over the presentation plan with her, giving clear and strict instructions about what he wanted her to deliver. But Julia, as attentive as she was, knew that any slight deviation could provoke a reaction from him that she increasingly feared. The pressure was immense, and she tried with all her might to remain calm, at least to not let her nervousness show. Executives began arriving punctually, filling the conference room with cool formality. Julia, next to Adam, felt out of place in that environment, but tried hard to maintain her posture. He started the meeting with an assertive presence that dominated the space, and everyone there seemed completely absorbed in his every word, which made Julia watch with a mixture of fascination and fear. It was as if Adam had an innate ability to make people pay attention without having to raise his voice. He conveyed an authority that left no room for doubt or questioning. During the meeting, however, Adam passed a document to Julia and asked her to share specific information with the other executives. Nervously, she started to speak, but got lost in the lines of the report. The number he mentioned was incorrect, a difference that did not compromise the content, but which, to Adam, seemed to be an unacceptable flaw. He interrupted her sharply, his sharp, irritated gaze darting across the table. "Did you even read the document before speaking?" he said, with a tone of contempt that resonated in the silent room. Julia felt her face burn with shame, as if all eyes were fixed on her, judging her competence, and she could barely respond. The room was filled with an awkward silence as Adam, clearly dissatisfied, corrected the number she had said wrong. The atmosphere was suffocating, and Julia had to muster all her strength not to give in to the urge to run away. The humiliation was overwhelming, and she felt small, as if none of the effort and dedication she had been putting in mattered there. At the end of the meeting, when everyone started to leave, Julia remained in the room, trying to catch her breath. Thoughts raced through her mind like a whirlwind, and she felt drained, as if Adam's every word had sapped her resolve. Her wounded pride and accumulated fatigue made her question whether she was still capable of staying there. I had already endured more than I thought I could, but after that public humiliation, everything seemed unsustainable. When he returned to his desk, the idea of giving up was more present than ever. Maybe that job wasn't for her. Maybe all that effort was in vain. As she tried to calm down and decide what to do, Julia heard voices coming from the hallway. It was Adam and his executive assistant, talking about their next appointment. The glass door to her office was ajar, and she overheard part of the conversation without meaning to. But something in the assistant's tone made her stop and pay attention. Adam replied something in a low voice, but enough for Julia to hear a sentence that didn't make sense. "I've never needed anyone, and I'm not going to start now." The assistant seemed to try to argue something about how delegating some tasks would lighten Adam's load, but he cut him off dryly, bringing the matter to an end. Julia was intrigued. The way he spoke seemed to suggest a story behind that phrase, a silent weight he carried alone. As much as he always demonstrated an inflexible and untouchable stance, Julia had a glimpse of something different, almost like a barrier that he wouldn't let anyone cross. In the days that followed, Julia began to observe Adam more closely, trying to understand what was behind that indestructible facade. Although he continued to treat her coldly and harshly, she was beginning to realize that perhaps there was a hidden layer beneath the armor he displayed. On a particularly quiet afternoon, Julia was in Adam's office reviewing some documents while he read something in silence. For a moment, he let his gaze wander out the window, and Julia noticed a distant, almost sad expression on his face. It wasn't something he let on often, but it was there, if only for a second. Her curiosity about Adam's past grew, and she found herself thinking about what could have shaped someone in such a rigid and relentless way. As if destiny was aligned to satisfy this curiosity, Julia discovered something unexpected when talking to one of the company's oldest employees, a discreet woman who had worked there since the founding of Grayson Tech and who had known Adam for years. During a coffee break, Julia mentioned Adam's uncompromising behavior, without imagining that her colleague would share more than simple impressions. "You know he practically grew up alone, don't you?" said the colleague with an understanding expression. Julia was surprised, and the employee continued, as if she felt she needed to clarify something. "His parents were business people who were always traveling, always too busy to spend time with him. From a young age, he learned not to depend on anyone. His coldness is a type of protection." Julia processed the information in silence. The image of Adam as a lonely, abandoned man was something she had never considered. This explained his impassive posture and his insistence on controlling everything around him, as if he feared losing something important if he let his guard down. That night, as Julia reflected on what she had discovered, she felt an unexpected pang of empathy. Even though he treated her harshly, she began to see something human and even vulnerable in Adam. Something that, in a way, made him seem less unbeatable. She understood what it was like to create barriers to protect herself, because in some way, she too had been protecting herself from life's blows since the divorce. The next day, as Adam was reviewing a report she had prepared, Julia noticed that he was quieter than usual. Upon handing over the document, she thanked him for giving her the chance to correct her error in the previous report. Adam seemed surprised by her initiative to bring up the subject and looked at her for a moment, as if trying to decipher what motivated her to stay there, despite all the difficulties. "I don't usually tolerate mistakes, and I hope you know that my demand is not something I will moderate to make your job easier," he said, in a firm but less merciless tone than usual. Julia nodded, without trying to justify herself. He just nodded, accepting his words naturally, as if he no longer expected any special treatment. Surprisingly, Adam continued, as if something made him want to justify himself, even without opening up completely. it's important to be in control. In life, you either control your circumstances or they control you. I can't afford to lose command. Julia listened in silence, feeling that, behind that speech, there was much more than he was revealing. And when she realized that he shared that perspective in an almost resigned way, she was sure that he was trapped by this need for control. Her instinct made her want to understand, but she knew that daring to ask more could create an even greater barrier between them. However, as the days went by, Julia began to deal with Adam more patiently, understanding that this extreme demand was perhaps a way of ensuring that no one could affect him as he had possibly already been affected. And although he continued to treat her harshly, as if he expected the same level of perfection from her that he demanded from himself, Julia found ways to carry out her duties with more confidence. At the end of a long day, Adam surprised her by asking her to finalize a cost sheet for an important project, and in a less harsh voice, made it clear that he trusted her with that task. Hearing his words, however brief, Julia realized that he was gradually gaining a position there, even if he would never admit it. Maybe it was a form of silent approval, but for her, it was a small victory in the midst of adversity. Adam might not be able to verbalize compliments, but he was beginning to show small signs that he saw her with more confidence. During the following weeks, the routine continued with moments of tension and small silent victories. Julia tried hard to do her work with even more precision, and in rare moments, she noticed a look of approval from Adam. But at the same time, she felt touched to realize that her presence at his side perhaps served something beyond the professional. In silence, she understood that that difficult and uncompromising man was, little by little, being revealed, showing the shadows that he kept under tireless control. Looking at him in a more empathetic way, Julia began to find in Adam an additional reason to persist, not only because of his obligations, but because of a mutual understanding that, little by little, developed between them. The cold and distant boss was no longer just an obstacle, but a reflection of someone who, like her, learned to resist. Julia entered the office the next morning, determined to maintain the pace she had been achieving. In recent weeks, despite all the challenges and humiliations she had already suffered, she was beginning to understand that Adam, as strict and relentless as he was, might not be the cold monster he appeared to be. But even with this realization, it was impossible to predict how he would react each day. Her mood remained erratic, and any slip-up on her part always seemed one step away from resulting in a severe reaction. This made the environment both unbearable and intriguing, a combination of fear and curiosity that gripped her in a way she herself didn't fully understand. First thing in the morning, Adam called her to review the day's agenda. He was quieter than usual, and Julia noticed that his gaze was fixed on something beyond the office window. The New York landscape seemed not to exist to him. His thoughts were clearly somewhere far away. When Julia handed over a stack of reports, he picked up one of them but remained silent for a moment. It was a different silence than what Julia was used to, denser, filled with something indefinite that seemed in conflict with the controlled and determined figure he presented to the world. "Today, we have an important meeting with the investors of O'Brien Holdings," he said, without looking directly at her, as if he were talking more to himself than to Julia. She nodded, awaiting instructions, but he remained lost in his own reflection. After an uncomfortable moment, Adam seemed to finally come to his senses. He squared his shoulders, adjusting his expression back to its usual control, as if he had decided it was time to compose himself. Julia watched the effort he made to re-establish that unshakable posture, and for a brief moment, she felt that perhaps he was also fighting something inside himself, against a past that silently tormented him. Later in the meeting, Adam resumed his assertive presence. As usual, he dominated the conversation, every word chosen with precision, every phrase designed to impress. However, Julia noticed a subtle change. Despite the effectiveness of his presentation, there was a trace of deconcentration. He made small mistakes, details that he would never normally miss, and Julia, who was watching him closely, noticed a slight tremor in his hands. Perhaps no one else had noticed, but she was there to support him, and, despite her nervousness, she felt compelled to intervene in a subtle way, organizing the documents in order for him and correcting small gaps in continuity. an almost invisible help, but which, she hoped, could make a difference. Adam ended the meeting on a conclusive note, and as he left, the executives nodded their approval, still under the impact of his performance. Julia, relieved, began to put away the materials, but was surprised when Adam stopped at the door and turned to her with a look that, to her surprise, seemed grateful. "Good work, Julia," he said, in an almost soft tone, although his face remained impassive. It was the first time he had praised her so clearly, and Julia almost doubted she had heard him correctly. Something inside her lit up, a discreet but still significant satisfaction, like a confirmation that the effort was starting to pay off. However, before he could thank or even react, Adam had already moved on, his expression returning to a state of absolute neutrality. That afternoon, back at the office, the mood between them seemed slightly different. Julia felt that her presence next to Adam was beginning to take on a new tone, something less formal and more complex. She could notice that when he spoke to her, the usual coldness seemed less intense, as if, for a brief moment, he forgot that there was a wall between them. Around the end of the day, while she was reviewing some notes at her desk, Adam left the office without saying a word and returned a few minutes later, carrying a small wooden box. He sat behind the desk, removed his wristwatch, and opened the box, revealing a series of documents and old photos. Julia tried not to show curiosity, but as she organized a new report, her gaze was drawn to the contents of that box. Adam then began to speak, almost as if he were alone, his voice low and distant. He mentioned that the box contained some memories from his childhood, a period he rarely allowed himself to return to. He didn't seem to want Julia to hear, but he didn't seem willing to keep those words in mind either. He said that, as a child, his parents were always away, traveling on business, and he spent most of his time alone, taking care of himself from a young age. His tone was unsentimental. On the contrary, he spoke with a cold objectivity, as if telling the story of the stranger. Still, Julia felt the underlying pain in every word, a pain he had never expressed, perhaps not even to himself. "I learned not to depend on anyone," he said, without looking at her. "If you don't expect anything from anyone, you won't be disappointed. That's what my parents taught me, even if not in words." Julia remained silent, respecting this moment of unusual vulnerability. That was a face of Adam that no one there probably knew. He never allowed his emotions to be visible, and at that moment, Julia understood that everything he did, every attitude, every unreasonable demand, was a reflection of that lonely childhood. He wasn't just a demanding boss. He was someone who carried a lifetime of forced self-sufficiency, of a protection built so he would never have to face abandonment again. Adam closed the wooden box abruptly, as if realizing he had exposed too much. He stood up, assuming his impassive and cold posture again. But Julia could see that something had changed, something faint that perhaps he himself would not be able to recognize. There was a silent empathy between them, an understanding that didn't need words. They were, in a sense, two people who had protected each other in different ways, but who, deep down, carried similar suffering. Julia returned to her table, trying to process what she had just witnessed. That revelation had given her a whole new perspective on Adam, and for the first time, she was able to see him as someone who also suffered. She felt a sudden desire to comfort him, to tell him that she understood what it was like to deal with pain and the weight of choices. But she knew he would never accept that. The only thing she could do was remain by his side, respecting the distance he imposed, but offering the support that she herself knew was essential to move forward. In the days that followed, Adam's behavior seemed to oscillate between the usual coldness and an almost imperceptible closeness, something that, for anyone else, would be invisible, but that Julia noticed with precision. He began to trust her with greater responsibilities, small tasks that required attention to detail, and that demonstrated a trust that she had not previously expected from him. This subtle change in behavior indicated that he was beginning to let his guard down, perhaps unconsciously, but enough for Julia to feel that she was slowly earning his respect. For Julia, this achievement was significant. Adam, despite his severity, was learning to recognize her effort, and she was willing to continue. Not only for the salary, but for what the job meant for herself. It was proof of his ability, his strength, a way of rediscovering himself as someone who could support himself, who had value. The barriers between her and Adam still existed, but little by little, and almost imperceptibly, they became less rigid. And although she tried to ignore it, she knew that, deep down, something more was forming between them. Julia was starting to feel more comfortable in Adam's presence. Although he maintained his usual coldness and demand, she noticed that something between them had changed. In the last few days, he even seemed less implacable, giving little glances that revealed some empathy. This tenuous yet subtle connection helped her relax. For the first time, she felt that her effort did not go unnoticed, as if Adam recognized her value, even without verbalizing it. That day, when she arrived at the office, Julia felt light, a rare feeling these days. But when unlocking her cell phone to check messages, she noticed a notification from her ex-husband's lawyer asking her to return urgently. Without knowing why, Julia called the number, trying to suppress the uneasiness that was beginning to form in her chest. The call was short and to the point. The lawyer informed her that her ex-husband was filing a lawsuit to obtain full custody of Max. Julia was in shock. Panic gripped her with a force she could barely process. Suddenly, the world around him seemed to fall apart. Max was the most important person in her life, and the thought of losing custody of him was unbearable. She felt unprotected, as if her ex-husband was plotting to take away the only thing that still kept her strong and determined. She tried to focus on her work, but her hands were shaking, and her vision began to blur with the tears that she tried, at all costs, to contain. Without realizing it, Julia let out a low sob, and Adam, who had just left her room, stopped when he saw her in that state. She tried to hide it, lowering her head and discreetly wiping her face, but it was too late. He had already noticed. Adam walked up to her, his cold expression softening slightly to an air of concern. "Julia, what happened?" he asked with a tone she had never heard from him before. Adam's voice had a different calm and seriousness, as if in that moment, he was prepared to understand. Julia hesitated, but there was something in his eyes that encouraged her. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice, and then, looking directly into his eyes, she told him about what she had just discovered. Her ex-husband had filed for custody, claiming that she was unable to provide a stable life for Max due to your financial situation. In telling everything, she realized that she was exposing the most vulnerable part of her life to Adam, someone who always seemed unbeatable, distant, and who would never have to deal with something so emotionally devastating. He listened to everything in silence, his gaze fixed on her. After a moment, Adam, without changing his firm and decisive tone, said, "That's not going to happen." Those words, spoken with almost cutting conviction, took Julia by surprise. Adam returned to his office, picked up the phone, and as Julia watched, he quickly dialed a number. "I need you in my office now," he ordered, with a determination that left her speechless. Within minutes, the company's chief lawyer was there, and Adam updated him on Julia's situation with impressive pragmatism, but with an intensity that suggested a personal involvement that Julia would never have expected. "My lawyer will take care of this personally," he said, looking directly at Julia in a show of support that was almost unbelievable. "We'll make sure Max stays with you." Julia felt an immense weight lift off her back, but she was still scared. Although grateful for Adam's support, she knew her ex-husband wouldn't give up easily, and that left her torn between temporary security and fear of what was yet to come. Adam, noticing her hesitation, placed his hand on her shoulder, a surprisingly affectionate gesture. "Trust in me. You are not alone, Julia. Not this time." His words sounded like a promise. Something broke inside her at that moment. She realized that she didn't need to fight this battle alone, that Adam was offering something beyond professional help. He was, for the first time, acting with a kind of protectiveness she would never expect from him. This realization shook her deeply, leaving her confused about what he really meant to her. Later, after meeting with Adam's assigned lawyer, Julia returned to her desk, still processing everything that had happened. Adam watched her from his living room, the expression on his face unreadable. She realized how hard he had tried to help her, and an unexpected sense of security enveloped her. Maybe there was more to Adam than he allowed people to see. He was not just that strict and unforgiving boss, but someone who, when necessary, reached out to protect those he thought deserved it. Julia felt her heart beat faster, a mixture of gratitude and confusion taking over her thoughts. In the days that followed, Adam continued to monitor her closely regarding the process. He demanded constant updates from the lawyer, and whenever there was new information, he called her to discuss the next steps. Even without mentioning it directly, he made it clear that he was willing to do whatever it took to ensure that Julia didn't lose Max. She felt an unexpected connection, a silent partnership that transcended the professional, as if he had decided to take this fight personally. One late afternoon, while they were reviewing some important documents from the case, Julia finally found the courage to thank him more directly. "Adam, I never expected to receive this help, and I don't even know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling with the sincerity of her emotion. He looked at her, and for a moment, a soft, almost affectionate expression passed over his face, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by the usual impenetrable gaze. "Julia, the world isn't always fair, but that doesn't mean we should accept it that way. You deserve a chance to fight for your child." The words were direct, but behind them was a restrained tenderness that she couldn't ignore. Adam quickly looked away, returning to the document, but Julia knew that something between them had changed profoundly. This was a side of Adam that few probably knew, and he was allowing her to see it, perhaps without realizing how much it touched her. The next day, the initial hearing was scheduled, and Julia felt the familiar panic return, fearing the allegations that her ex-husband might bring against her. Adam noticed her anxiety and, upon seeing her visibly shaken, suggested that they go out for a walk, an unprecedented and surprising gesture from him. They walked in silence through the city's busy streets, and when they stopped at a coffee shop, Adam bought her a coffee, something that made Julia smile shyly, a break in the formal layers that normally separated them. They sat at the table, and Julia, feeling safe in his presence, opened up about what was worrying her. He spoke of the difficulties he had faced after the divorce, the pain of seeing Max suffering with the changes and the sleepless nights, fearing he would lose the only link that kept his life in balance. Adam listened to her attentively, without interrupting, without passing judgment. He just watched, as if her every word mattered. For Julia, this was a new experience, feeling like someone really understood her, that someone wasn't there to judge her or point out flaws, but to offer genuine support. When they finished their coffee, Adam said something that left her speechless. "I know what it's like to lose the people who matter most." She looked at him, surprised by the revelation. His gaze was distant, and Julia felt a deep connection in that moment. There was a shared suffering between them, a pain that brought them together in ways she never could have imagined. Julia understood that as strong as Adam seemed, he had also been scarred by loss, and that the armor he wore was actually a way to survive those old wounds. The connection that formed between them seemed, in some way, healing, as if when facing that process, they were both also dealing with their own pain and limitations. Adam's support was more than just practical help. It was proof that he believed in her and her ability to win this fight, even if she doubted herself. Julia felt strong but at the same time vulnerable in front of him, and somehow this shared vulnerability brought her a relief she didn't know she needed. The first hearing was scheduled for the following week, and during the days leading up to it, Adam proved to be a constant and steady presence. He encouraged her to keep her head up and be resilient, while the lawyers worked tirelessly to gather evidence that Julia was capable of providing the safe and stable environment needed. Adam's words and look were a constant reminder that she wasn't alone. He believed in her, and that was all she needed to face her ex-husband with determination and courage. The night before the hearing, Adam called her into his office for one last review of the documents, but at the end of the meeting, he did something unexpected. He took her hand, squeezing it firmly. The warmth of his hand was comforting, and Julia felt her heart quicken. "It's going to be okay," he said, looking into her eyes. "Don't let him intimidate you. You are much stronger than you imagine." Those words touched her deeply, and as she left the room, Julia realized that this battle was not just about keeping Max by her side, but also about proving to herself that she was capable of facing any challenge, no matter how painful and difficult. Scary as it was, Adam was right. She was strong, and with him by your side, for the first time, you truly believed it. The next day, at the hearing, Julia faced her ex-husband with a confidence she never imagined she would have. Adam was in the audience, watching her, and whenever her gaze met his, she felt a surge of security that strengthened her. At the end of the hearing, the judge decided that the case needed further investigation. But for now, Max would remain in her care. When they left the courtroom, Julia could barely contain her emotion. She felt exhausted, but also relieved and grateful. When she turned to Adam, she saw a discreet smile on his face. And without thinking, she hugged him, forgetting for a moment the barriers that normally existed between them. He hesitated, but returned the hug, and in that moment, Julia realized that the connection between them had become something that went far beyond that of boss and assistant. She didn't know what the future held for them, but she was sure that this bond, unexpected and deep, was real. The atmosphere at the company was especially hectic that week. Grayson Tech's annual gala was about to take place, a night of formalities and speeches where Adam, as CEO, would be the center of attention. Julia, who until then had only witnessed formal events on television or in films, was apprehensive. He had never participated in such an important occasion, especially accompanying Adam, who had asked him to be present to coordinate details and ensure that the evening's agenda ran smoothly. Upon seeing the invitation in her name, formally addressed by the company, Julia felt butterflies in her stomach. The night arrived quickly, and Julia was ready in an elegant, understated dress that she had borrowed. When she looked in the mirror before going out, she felt strange, as if she was wearing a version of herself that she had never known. It would be the first time she was with Adam outside of the office, away from the reports and meeting rooms, and a new kind of nervousness came over her. The event took place at a luxury hotel in Manhattan. The ballroom impeccably decorated with flower arrangements and crystal chandeliers. Upon entering the room, Julia felt dazzled by the environment and a little out of place when she noticed that everyone around her seemed so used to that glamour. That's when her eyes found Adam. He was impeccably dressed, in an elegant black suit and a serious expression, although when he noticed her, something in his gaze softened. He approached, holding out his hand for her to hold as he led her across the room, something that surprised her. It was a polite, almost formal gesture, but Julia felt a sudden tension in his touch. Adam's gaze was intense, and although he tried to maintain his composure, she knew he also noticed this growing connection. As he introduced her to other executives and business partners, Julia felt increasingly comfortable with him. As if together, they formed a team that understood each other without needing words. After some speeches and toasts, Adam took the stage to speak, and Julia watched intently. He was in his element, confident, charismatic, controlled. The Adam she saw at that moment was someone who dominated everything and everyone around him. The Adam who led Grayson Tech and who commanded so much respect. However, she knew that that man on the stage was just one facet of him. It was that more human side, hidden beneath the layers of power, that she was beginning to know and admire, but at the same time feared. When the event finally ended, Adam and Julia were talking about the final details near the entrance to the ballroom, waiting for the last guest to say goodbye. The mood had become lighter, and he, at least for that night, seemed more relaxed. Julia couldn't remember the last time she'd seen him so at ease. As they spoke, the laughter escaped them both naturally, as if they had forgotten the formalities of the office. Suddenly, at the end of the conversation, Julia realized that she was closer to Adam than she had imagined. He didn't move away, and for a moment, they remained there, in silence, their gazes locked on each other. She felt her breath catch, a mixture of curiosity and desire taking over. She couldn't explain where that impulse came from, but Adam's eyes seemed to have the same intense, indecipherable glow that pulled her closer. Before they could hesitate, he leaned in slightly, and their lips touched, briefly, but with an intensity that made her forget everything around her. The kiss only lasted a few seconds, but it was enough to make Julia's heart race. That touch, full of repressed feelings and shared silences, contained more than words could say. She felt that something inevitable had happened between them, something that they both seemed to have held onto for a long time, but that had finally escaped. However, the weight of reality soon caught up with them, and Adam stepped back, adjusting his shirt collar and rising again. He looked away, taking a deep breath, while Julia stood there, trying to catch her breath and absorb what had just happened. She also felt the weight of the implications, of the barriers that separated them, and the consequences of letting that moment continue to come to life. After an awkward moment of silence, Adam broke the tension with a brief, almost formal sentence and walked her to the door. It was clear that they were both trying to regain control, moving away from the vulnerability of that moment. When they reached the taxi that would take her home, Adam stared at her for a long moment, but he didn't say anything. His look seemed to contain 1,000 words, but Julia knew that neither she nor he were prepared to say them. When she closed the door, she saw that he was still watching her, a mix of uncertainty and desire on his face. On the way home, Julia rested her head on the seat and closed her eyes, reliving the moment over and over again. Every detail of that kiss, the touch of his lips, the look in his eyes before and after, seemed still present, echoing in her mind. But at the same time, worries and fears began to accumulate. She was just his assistant, a single mother with responsibilities that didn't allow her to lose herself in romantic illusions. Adam was her boss, someone who lived in a completely different world from hers, someone who could never be part of her real life. That night, when he returned home, Max was already asleep, but Julia sat next to him, feeling torn between what she had experienced and what she knew was right. Max was her world, her absolute priority, and she couldn't allow herself to be distracted, especially with someone like Adam. As much as that closeness awakened intense feelings and, for the first time in years, a sense of romantic hope, Julia knew she couldn't risk everything she had built with so much difficulty. When she woke up the next morning, reality returned with full force, and Max's presence there, with her innocent smile, reinforced the decision that Julia needed to make. She would do her best to keep things strictly professional between her and Adam, no matter how difficult it was. He needed this to maintain his own emotional and financial stability, and he knew that the complexity of their worlds would never allow a relationship between them to be simple or safe. At work, she tried her best to avoid any reference to what had happened. She kept herself busy, and although she felt Adam's occasional glances, she ignored them, focusing only on completing her tasks. To his surprise, Adam seemed to respect this distance. He maintained a professional tone and avoided any attempt at personal contact, as if he understood the decision she had made. But they both knew something had changed, something impossible to ignore. As the days went by, this distance became a visible barrier, but one that protected both of them from the dangerous proximity that had established between them. Julia stood her ground, but at night, in silence, she allowed herself to think about what could have been if their lives had been different. This thought repeated itself like a persistent whisper, and she realized that, despite all her attempts, her feelings for Adam did not disappear. On the contrary, they seemed to gain more strength every day, like a flame that was controlled but impossible to put out. For Adam, office encounters became more difficult. Julia was a constant presence in his mind, and the intensity of their shared moment continued to unsettle him. He understood that that relationship could never happen, but that wasn't enough to take away what he felt. However, in his cold expression and absolute control, he remained unyielding, knowing that crossing that line meant risking everything. Even though they kept up appearances, they both seemed to constantly struggle with their own feelings. Small gestures, quick glances, and restrained words, everything revealed how much more and more connected they were. And despite the decision to move away, each day became more complicated. The proximity between them was now a force that attracted them and that they needed to resist. Because, deep down, they knew that crossing that line could mean giving up everything they fought for. Over time, Julia began to question her future at Grayson Tech. The idea of working alongside Emma, knowing that something much deeper united them, but that could never come to fruition, was an emotional burden that left her exhausted. His life was Max, and he needed his mother focused, not torn between duties and a romance that only existed in her mind. Adam also noticed the changes and the weight of that closeness that they both tried to hide. In quiet moments, he wondered if, at some point, he would allow himself to break through that armor and explore how he felt about Julia. However, their decision to keep their distance became an implicit rule, something necessary for both of them to stay on their own path, even if that was the most painful path. At the end of another intense day, when the hallways were empty and the office lights were turning off one by one, Adam and Julia passed each other in silence, each about to leave. For a moment, they both stopped, as if the weight of that silent goodbye was about to break the barriers they had built. But before any words were spoken, Julia gave a slight nod and left, leaving Adam standing there, watching as she disappeared down the hall. Adam stayed, watching the emptiness, and knew that maybe, in that silent goodbye, something between them had truly ended. The week was almost over when Julia received an unexpected message. The sender was none other than her ex-husband, Ethan. When you saw his name on the screen, a chill ran down your spine. It had been a long time since he had tried to contact her directly, and each previous conversation had left a trail of hurt and insecurity. This time, however, he seemed to take a different approach, sending a direct and courteous text requesting a conversation to discuss important matters concerning Max's well-being. Julia, instinctively, wanted to ignore the message, but she knew she needed to hear what he had to say, even if it meant facing emotions she thought she had overcome. The next day, Ethan proposed that they meet at a discreet coffee shop downtown. When she arrived, Julia saw that he was already sitting, more tidy than usual, with an expression that seemed carefully rehearsed. He stood up when he saw her and smiled, as if hoping that kindness would ease the weight of his past actions. Julia kept her expression serious, controlling the inner turmoil that seeing Ethan always aroused. "Julia, thank you for coming," he began, his voice too controlled and polite for someone she knew so well. "I think you'll like to know how much I've changed. I know I've made a lot of mistakes in the past, but..." He paused, sighing, as if he was truly sorry. "Julia, I just want the best for Max right now." She watched warily, crossing her arms as he spoke. It was difficult for her to believe this sudden change. Ethan had always been skilled at manipulating situations to appear convincing. At the time of their marriage, he had made her believe that everything was fine while he slowly dismantled her self-confidence and controlled every aspect of her life. The firm look he was giving her now only rekindled memories of how difficult it had been to free herself from his influence. She didn't want to get involved again, but her emotional security seemed fragile in the face of the confidence and persuasive tone he displayed. "Ethan, be direct. What do you really want?" Julia asked, her voice firm, trying to demonstrate that she would not be influenced by any emotional artifice. He hesitated, but kept his tone calm and continued, "Julia, I know Max is your world, and I care about him too. I want to be a present father." He paused, as if measuring each word, before continuing. "I know you're trying hard, but looking at the life you lead now, at the difficulties, I really believe that Max would be better off with me. I have financial stability, a suitable home, and a new perspective." The final blow came with a serious look, and she understood what he was implying. He believed that by emphasizing his stability and suggesting that she led an unstable life, he could make her feel incapable, insecure, and finally give in. That idea sounded like a punch, making the blood boil in his veins. Ethan wasn't just there to redeem himself or try to live peacefully for Max. He wanted to once again take control, as he had done so many times before. Julia took a deep breath, trying to control her tone as she replied, "I know you want the best for Max, Ethan, but it's naive to think that presenting yourself as a changed person will erase everything that happened. My focus is his well-being, and he is fine where he is. Nothing has changed about that." His face contorted for a brief moment, but he soon returned to smiling, as if he had anticipated this resistance. "I understand, Julia, but think carefully. I am willing to resolve this amicably. After all, we are his parents and we want the best, right?" The conversation ended cold and distant, but Julia left with a feeling of defeat, even though she remained firm in her answers. She knew that Ethan wouldn't give up easily, and that any action he took would be an attempt to emotionally undermine her until she doubted herself. It was exhausting and painful pressure, and it was all reflected in his face when he returned to work. That day, Julia was especially distracted, lost in her thoughts, wondering what else Ethan could plan and how she could protect Max without breaking emotionally. Adam noticed that she was not well, and after a long moment of silence, called her to his room. "Julia, something is wrong," he said, his voice firm but full of concern. "I noticed that you are different since yesterday. Can I help with something?" She hesitated. Part of her didn't want to involve Adam in her personal problems, but the weight of the situation was too much to bear alone. She looked at him, looking for the strength she already knew existed in Adam's presence, and began to tell him about her meeting with Ethan. He spoke hesitantly at first, but over time the words flowed more easily, revealing the fear and feeling of helplessness that he still aroused in her. Adam listened to her attentively, and when she finished, his face was more serious than usual. He knew the kind of control Ethan tried to exert over Julia, and the idea of someone threatening her made him angry. She noticed that he kept his fists clenched as he spoke, and the look in Adam's eyes conveyed something other than compassion. It was a protective desire that she didn't know how to process. "This type of person doesn't change, Julia," he said in a firm voice, "and he's trying to control you through fear. But you are Max's mother and the person he needs. Don't let Ethan make you doubt that." Adam's words touched Julia deeply, and she felt a wave of relief, as if she could finally trust that she was not alone in this confrontation. However, she realized that her closeness to Adam could be used against her, and this made her question the choices she was making alongside him. Over the next week, Adam remained attentive to Julia, watching for any signs of uneasiness. Whenever she started to feel overwhelmed, he seemed to notice, and his constant presence reassured her. He avoided mentioning Ethan directly, but in subtle ways he made a point of reminding her of his strength and that she could count on him, which gave Julia renewed courage. On a particularly difficult afternoon, Ethan unexpectedly appeared in front of the building where Julia worked. Julia caught a glimpse of him through the window and felt panic set in again. She didn't want him to cause a scene or try to manipulate the situation there, but before she could take action, Adam appeared at her side, immediately realizing the cause of her tension. "Is he here?" Adam asked with a firm tone of voice, but with a calmness that made her breathe a little easier. She just nodded, and Adam approached, keeping a watchful eye as he watched Ethan's figure, who seemed to wait impatiently near the building's entrance. Without hesitation, Adam suggested that she remain inside the building while he dealt with the situation. When going out to meet Ethan, Adam approached without haste, but his posture was imposing. Ethan looked surprised to see Adam addressing him, and the coldness in Adam's eyes was visible. "You must be her boss, right?" Ethan asked with a mocking smile, as if trying to hide his discomfort. "I'm Julia's boss, yes, and my job is to ensure that she has the safety and respect necessary to do her job," Adam responded, with a firm tone that clearly indicated he would not tolerate any interference or threats. The tension between them was palpable, but Adam kept his gaze fixed, conveying a confidence that made Ethan falter for a moment. Even though he was reluctant, Ethan didn't insist, giving one last disdainful look before walking away, as if he didn't want to risk a direct confrontation. Adam remained there until he was out of sight and then returned to the office, where Julia was waiting for him, visibly nervous. "He's gone," Adam said, with a calmness that, to Julia, sounded almost like a promise of protection. "As long as you're here, no one will threaten you, Julia." Those words echoed in her heart with a weight she couldn't ignore. She thanked him, a little shaky, but deeply touched by the way he had interceded. Adam was not just an authoritarian and demanding boss. He was willing to fight alongside her, to be an unconditional support, even in the midst of such a delicate situation. However, that intervention from Adam also made her question the path she was taking alongside him. Ethan's intentions, manipulative as they were a painful reminder that his life and Adam's could not so easily intertwine. Adam was a powerful, influential man, and his help was a balm for his difficult days. But Julia knew that allowing him to become more deeply involved in her life could have consequences that would affect them both, and especially Max. despite the protection and security that Adam offered her. Julia understood that, eventually, she would have to face Ethan alone. Ethan would probably continue to look for ways to control her, and she would have to find an inner strength that didn't depend on anyone else. Adam was by her side now, but there was a part of her that feared getting used to that support because she knew that sooner or later, she would have to deal with her battles without him. That night, as she put Max to sleep, Julia reflected on her own choices, the conflicting emotions that Adam aroused, and the sense of security he brought in such a fragile moment. Deep down, I knew that this bond with Adam was more than a professional relationship, but I feared the implications of allowing that to develop. Her priority was to protect Max, and any decision that compromised that responsibility caused her to retreat. At the end of the day, Julia slept with the feeling that the future brought with it uncertain challenges, but with the certainty that in the present, she had someone willing to protect her, even if this dangerous proximity threatened to shake the certainties that she had worked so hard for. Had built, Adam began to suspect Ethan's intentions. Something about his behavior, his sudden appearance and insistence on Max's custody, didn't seem legitimate to him. Adam knew how to recognize falsehood, and the way Ethan had tried to get closer to Julia and even destabilized her with insinuations about her own ability as a mother had left him with an uneasiness that he could not ignore. Determined to better understand what was going on, Adam used his contacts to investigate Julia's ex-husband discreetly, without informing her. He felt that if she knew, she would try to stop him. Julia was a proud woman and jealous of her privacy, but he also knew that he was in a position that allowed him to protect people important to him. And Julia had definitely become someone important. When the results of the investigation arrived, Adam couldn't hide his surprise. The information showed that Ethan was in a critical financial situation. In recent years, he had engaged in poorly planned investments, accumulating significant debt, with a company recently bankrupt and assets being liquidated. Ethan, it seemed, was not seeking custody of Max out of love or concern, but out of desperation. It was possible that he was looking for an agreement involving a pension or financial compensation to alleviate his situation. Adam was now certain that Julia's ex-husband was nothing more than an opportunist trying to use his son as a bargaining chip. Outraged and eager to protect Julia, Adam went to her office determined to warn her, but his approach ended up taking an unexpected turn. Julia was concentrated on her work, but when she saw him enter with a serious expression, she straightened up, attentive. "Julia, we need to talk about Ethan," he began, without preamble, his voice full of seriousness. She frowned, surprised by the direct mention of her ex-husband, but agreed, leaning in slightly to listen. "I discovered something important about him, something you need to know," he continued, with an incisive tone that left no room for doubt. "Ethan is broke. His companies are deep in debt, and he has nothing left. That's why he's trying for custody. He wants money." Julia was shocked by Adam's words. Although her relationship with Ethan was far from peaceful, she had never imagined that he would go so far as to try to manipulate the situation to gain financial advantage. Adam's revelation left her paralyzed. A series of painful memories came flooding back, and she began to see Ethan's actions in a new light, realizing how carefully he had been strategizing to manipulate her. But in the next instant, something about Adam's posture made her uncomfortable. He continued to watch her with an almost condescending look, as if he was judging not only Ethan, but also her ability to see the truth. Before he could process everything, Adam, on a miscalculated impulse, commented, "I can't believe you actually thought he was being sincere. Julia, Ethan is the type of man who takes advantage of everything and everyone to get what he wants. I thought you knew that." Those words were like a cold blade. Adam's tone, which had previously been protective, now took on a veiled criticism, as if he saw her as a naive and easily deceived woman. Julia, who until then had absorbed everything attentively, felt a wave of frustration and humiliation wash over her. She looked at him, her expression hardening as she realized that, in that moment, he didn't see her as someone fighting to protect her son, but as someone easily manipulated. "So that's what you think of me?" she asked, her voice choked but contained. That I'm too naive to realize the kind of person Ethan is. Adam hesitated, surprised by her tone, but stood his ground, not realizing how accusatory his words had sounded. Julia, I just want you to understand that you need to be more careful. He already manipulated you once and is trying to do it again. I thought you were more careful about that. With each word, Julia felt more diminished. She already faced constant insecurities about her ability to protect Max and provide him with a safe home. The suggestion that she couldn't discern Ethan's true nature, made by someone she was beginning to trust, hit her like a low blow. Everything she had built up in terms of self-confidence and determination seemed to crumble under the weight of that judgment. You know, Adam, I thought you understood what I went through, but clearly you just see me as a weak woman who needs to be protected from her own choices, he replied with a hard look. And I don't need you to tell me how manipulative Ethan is. I know him better than anyone, but at least I respect the fact that he is the father of my son. This is something you won't understand. Adam was silent, realizing too late the mistake he had made. He watched her for a long moment, Julia's eyes burning with disappointment and anger. He felt helpless, and any attempt at an apology seemed empty given what he had said. He wanted to protect her, but in the process, he had ended up hurting her deeply, underestimating her strength and her ability to understand her own battles. Julia turned and left the room, leaving Adam speechless. As he walked through the company's corridors, his mind was filled with a mixture of hurt and anger. She felt betrayed by someone who, in recent times, had become a fundamental presence in her life. Someone who had made her believe she could trust, but who now judged her like any other superficial person. For the rest of the day, she avoided crossing his path, focusing on her work and trying to ignore the pain that throbbed in her chest. This had been more than an argument. It was as if an invisible barrier had been erected between them, a barrier that would likely be difficult to break through. Adam may have had good intentions, but his inability to understand the most sensitive aspects of her reality had made her see that he, deep down, did not understand the complexities of her life. While Julia struggled to maintain her composure, Adam, in his living room, felt uncomfortably vulnerable. He had never allowed himself to make mistakes in his judgments, and the idea that his words could have caused so much damage bothered him deeply. He now realized that, in trying to protect her, he had let himself be carried away by the need to control the situation. But in doing so, he had ended up treating her as someone incapable of dealing with her own life. He knew that Julia was a strong woman, a dedicated mother, and someone who had faced a lot to get here. But in his rush to save her from her ex-husband's influence, he had ignored her own autonomy. That night, Julia returned home feeling more tired than usual. She spent a long time at Max's side, gazing at the small, sleeping face that represented her greatest source of strength and also her greatest responsibility. She was determined to protect him from any threat, but now she understood that she would have to fight not only against Ethan, but also against the feeling that those around her saw her as a victim, someone fragile who needed to be defended at all costs. In the following days, Julia stayed away from Adam, fulfilling her obligations with a distant formality. Adam noticed the change but respected her decision, allowing silence to settle between them. A silence that felt like a self-imposed punishment for failing at a crucial moment. He wanted to apologize, try to make amends for what he had done, but he knew Julia needed space to process and deal with her feelings. The distance between them became more painful every day, as if an invisible wound was being opened, slowly separating them. To Julia, the trust that had begun to form between them now seemed like an illusion. She respected Adam for his unconditional support in the past, but at the same time, she knew that this incident had shown a side of him that she couldn't ignore. It was the controlling and meticulous side, the side that believed it knew what was best for others, even if its intentions were noble. And Julia knew she needed someone who saw her as an equal, not as someone who needed constant protection. Over the weeks, Julia regained her strength and focus, deciding that she would face Ethan and his games on her own. She began investigating his finances through legal means, gathered evidence and worked tirelessly to strengthen her custody case. Deep down, a part of her still remembered Adam's words and felt torn between admiration and hurt. There was no denying his importance in her life, but she also couldn't give up her autonomy and her ability to fight alone. Adam, in turn, continued to watch Julia from a distance, missing her like an open wound that wouldn't heal. He respected her strength and understood that he needed to apologize in a way that proved he saw her as someone independent and capable. He was determined to find a way to regain her trust, to show that, despite everything, he valued her and saw her for the resilient woman she really was. The next few weeks dragged on for Julia, each one heavier than the last. She was dealing with a whirlwind of feelings, but she kept her face straight and her posture unwavering. While working, I avoided any unnecessary interactions with Adam. Only the essentials were discussed between them, and she had closed any gap for conversations that could indicate closeness or even an attempt at reconciliation. He focused on his work with determination, channeling all his energy into staying focused. He knew he needed to be strong not only for himself, but mainly for Max. Adam, in turn, respected this distance, although he was attentive to every detail of her reactions, looking for some sign of openness that indicated that he could apologize or at least clarify what he really meant in that unfortunate conversation. But Julia remained unshakable, maintaining the barrier she had erected between them, and this distance tormented him. He realized now, more clearly than ever, how much she meant to him, how much he wanted to be by her side at all times, especially the most difficult ones. However, he knew that any approach at that moment would be invasive and would probably make Julia withdraw even more. For Julia, the days were a tiring and exhausting routine. But at night, when she put Max to sleep, she was overcome by an unexpected longing. He left his room with the weight of loneliness on his chest, missing a genuine connection, someone with whom he could share his doubts and fears. No matter how much she fought those thoughts, Adam loomed in her mind, and she hated the feeling that he still had that effect on her. I wished it were easy to erase everything they had shared, every moment of support and every gesture of understanding. But everything remained present, resisting the distance between them. Things came to a head one morning when Julia received a formal summons for Max's first custody hearing. As he read the content, his heart skipped a beat. Ethan was claiming that, by prioritizing her career, she was neglecting her son, and that she did not have enough financial stability to provide Max with a peaceful life. The accusations hurt her deeply, and she realized that Ethan was willing to use any tricks to try to gain custody. Insecurity and fear began to grow in her, and Julia needed a few minutes alone to absorb the news before she could return to work. That day, Adam noticed the dejection on her face, and the silence Julia carried with her was even thicker than usual. He watched her, and although he hesitated, he could no longer ignore what he saw. He approached and asked, in a softer tone of voice than he used to use since their separation between them, "Julia, what's going on?" She sighed, reluctant to share something so painful with him. But, tired of fighting alone, she ended up showing Adam the subpoena without saying anything. He read the document carefully, his face hardening as the words revealed Ethan's accusations. When he finished, he handed the paper back to her, his eyes conveying controlled fury. "That's absurd, Julia," he said, with a firmness that revealed deep indignation. "He can't claim that you're not capable of taking care of your own child. Ethan knows how dedicated you are to Max. He's just trying to manipulate you, like he always has." Julia looked away, feeling a mix of anger and frustration. The last thing she wanted was to hear that she was being manipulated again, especially from Adam, who was still associated in her mind with feelings of humiliation and judgment. She felt he wanted to help, but pride and resentment prevented her from genuinely accepting his intervention. "I know what he's trying to do, Adam, but that doesn't change the fact that he's willing to use anything against me," she said, unable to hide the tremor in her voice. "And I don't have as much financial means as he does. This battle is unfair." Adam watched her in silence, absorbing the anguish she displayed. He was determined to help, but he didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, where his desire to protect her had been misinterpreted as condescension. He felt that he would need a different approach so that Julia would understand that he was by her side, willing to give the support she needed without questioning her ability. "Julia, I know you have every right to resent me," he said, in a more serious tone, his eyes fixed on hers. "But let me help you. If Ethan wants to turn this into a dispute, we won't let him do it alone. You are a dedicated mother, and we both know it. You deserve to have Max by your side, without having to prove it to anyone. I don't want to control your life or dictate what's best for you. I just want you to know that you are not alone." Julia was silent, absorbing his words. Something about the way he spoke now sounded different, more understanding and respectful, without the harshness of previous times. As much as she wanted to stand firm in her decision not to trust Adam again, those words softened a little the hurt she still carried. There was sincerity in his gaze, and she felt that perhaps he had truly understood the impact his initial judgment had made. The idea of dealing with Ethan alone, without the support she knew Adam could provide, seemed increasingly untenable. After a long sigh, Julia nodded in a gesture of subdued acceptance. It was a sign that she allowed Adam to help her, but without compromising her own autonomy. Adam seemed to understand, giving her a brief smile, and she saw relief in his eyes, as if that gesture of acceptance was all he needed to show that his intention was finally genuine. In the weeks that followed, Adam began to act like a true ally. He hired one of the best lawyers specializing in family disputes, instructing him to handle the case with the highest priority. Julia, in turn, began working alongside the lawyer, gathering evidence that she was always present in Max's life, and that her dedication to her work was, in fact, a way of guaranteeing a future for him. It was an exhausting process, but Adam was by her side every step of the way, offering support and encouragement without ever directly interfering or imposing any decisions. However, the trial approached, and Julia began to feel the pressure increase. Ethan, as expected, was not willing to back down. One afternoon, while she was meeting with her lawyer to review the final strategy, Ethan showed up unexpectedly, wanting to talk to her. Adam, who was nearby, stepped between them, making it clear that any conversation would go through him first. Julia was tense about the situation, but observed Adam's firm and calm posture, who dealt with Ethan in a protective and respectful manner. He didn't yell or lose his temper, but his tone made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate any kind of pressure or manipulation. Ethan, however, seemed impassive, casting calculated and disdainful glances. She knew that, in some way, Adam's presence could be used against Julia, an issue that he would certainly explore during the trial, trying to insinuate that she had prioritized work and professional relationships over maternal responsibility. After this encounter, Julia was visibly shaken. The idea that Ethan would use anything against her, including the support Adam offered him, was distressing. She felt a huge weight, realizing that any false step could be distorted by Ethan, who continued with his calculated and manipulative game. Adam noticed her despair and tried to comfort her, but Julia avoided deepening the conversation, fearing that their closeness would be seen as frailty. She couldn't afford to depend on him emotionally when all she needed was her own strength. On the day of the hearing, Julia woke up early, with her heart racing and a growing nervousness that she could barely disguise. As she entered the courtroom and saw Ethan on the other side, she felt butterflies in her stomach as she realized he was wearing a confident smile, as if he knew he had the upper hand. She looked at Max, who was sitting between them, and knew that any sacrifice was worth it to keep him by her side, to ensure that he grew up in a safe environment, away from Ethan's negative influences. Adam arrived just before the session began, and his gaze met Julia's, offering her silent but unwavering support. He knew that this was a decisive moment and that any word could affect her decisions. Thus, he remained silent, monitoring the situation from a distance, but making it clear that he was present and available for anything she needed. As the hearing began, Ethan's allegations were scathing, a string of criticisms of Julia's stability and her life choices. Julia felt each accusation as a blow, but she stood firm, maintaining that her work and the environment she created for Max were proof of her commitment as a mother. In her defense, the lawyer showed evidence that she was always by her son's side, with records of moments and situations in which Max needed support, with Julia being the first to be present. Throughout the hearing, Adam continued to watch her, his posture rigid and focused, but his eyes conveying unconditional support. Julia realized that, Regardless of everything, he had become an essential pillar at that moment, a pillar of support that she had never imagined finding. At the end of the session, the judge indicated that the decision would still require a more detailed evaluation, but assured that Max would remain with Julia until the case was analyzed again. Julia felt enormous relief, but still knew that the battle was far from over. As Ethan left the courtroom, giving her a threatening look, Julia stood her ground, feeling a new strength, determined to protect what she loved most. As they left, Adam approached her and, without saying a word, held her hand for a brief moment, but long enough for Julia to feel the support he was offering. Grateful, she gave a slight smile, feeling that, despite all the difficulties, she was ready to face whatever came her way. With Adam by her side and her own determination as her guide, she knew nothing would stop her from winning this fight. The trip to Grayson Tech's annual conference started like any other work commitment. Julia, although she still had some reservations about Adam, had agreed to accompany him as his assistant. It was an important opportunity and also a professional challenge that would help her focus on her career and continue the custody process with the feeling of progressing in other aspects of her life. The trip would take them to Chicago, where Adam would present to potential investors and partners, and where Julia would take responsibility for coordinating all the details to ensure everything went according to plan. From the beginning, Julia kept busy, reviewing documents and aligning schedules, while Adam, although focused, seemed quieter than usual. He limited himself to reviewing some papers, but she noticed that his gaze, normally fixed and attentive, sometimes got lost, as if his mind was stuck somewhere in the past. This was not like him. Adam always conveyed the sensation of being completely immersed in the present, always focused and rational. She couldn't help but wonder what was going on in his mind. They arrived at the hotel late in the afternoon, and Adam soon went to his room without his usual expansive energy. Julia knew the presentation the next day was important, but something told her there was more to it than professional stress. After finishing preparations for the event, Julia went to reception and was surprised by a brief conversation she overheard between two hotel employees, commenting that the Grayson family name had been known there for many years. Curious, she discreetly asked if they knew more about the family's history, as Adam didn't usually talk about his past. One of the employees, an older man, revealed that he had known Adam's story since he was a child. His family used to spend their summers here, he explained, with a tone that mixed longing and regret. His father, George Grayson, was a prestigious businessman, but very reserved, and his mother was a lovely woman, but she always seemed distant, lost. Adam was just a boy at the time, but it was clear that I spent most of my time alone. Julia remained silent, absorbing those words. For the first time, he glimpsed an image of Adam different from the one he showed in the present. Not only was the CEO sure of himself, he was also a lonely boy, left aside while his parents were busy with their own lives. Perhaps that was why Adam maintained a rigid posture and constant control over his emotions, as if protecting himself from an emotional emptiness that seemed to have arisen very early. Upon returning to her room, Julia couldn't get the story out of her head. The way Adam dedicated himself to his work and the way he built barriers in his personal relationships now seemed to echo that lonely childhood. A past that, in some ways, he still carried, and with which it seemed he had never made amends. Peace. As she reflected on this, she felt a deep desire to help him, to show him that he was no longer alone. However, he knew that any attempt to get closer would need to be careful, as Adam, even when faced with any empathy, was still the type of person who would withdraw at the slightest sign of vulnerability. The next day, during the presentation, Adam seemed determined, but Julia noticed that he was particularly tense, as if something in that environment made him return to the past. He conducted the presentation with his usual precision, but instead of radiating the confidence she was used to seeing, he seemed almost cold, meticulous in a mechanical way. When the presentation ended, Adam made a point of leaving quickly, without even waiting for the praise and congratulations from the investors. Julia followed him, worried about his behavior and determined to understand what was going on. That night, when Adam was alone in the hotel's bar area, Julia finally approached, and he watched her with a tired expression, as if part of his armor had been temporarily abandoned. He invited her to sit down and was silent for a few minutes, which was unusual for someone so direct and practical. "This place," he began, with an almost absent tone of voice. "It brings back a lot of memories. They're not all good." She nodded, waiting for him to continue. The drink in his hands felt untouched, as if he weren't really there, but trapped in memories he couldn't escape. "My father was a very private man, and the word success was almost all he knew. He believed that work was the center of everything, and that any distraction he paused. Looking distant was a weakness. My mother, she had a good heart, but she always seemed like a foreigner in her own home. I wasn't happy, and we all knew that, but no one talked about it. Everything had to look perfect, even if it was falling apart." Julia listened attentively, feeling the weight of his words. Each sentence seemed like a piece of a painful puzzle that was finally starting to make sense. "I learned from an early age that, in order not to be left behind, I needed to be the best," he continued, in a low, almost inaudible voice. "There was no room for mistakes or for depending on someone. I think that's why I became like this. Control freak, distant." Julia felt a pang of pain for him. "I wanted to say something that could ease that weight, but I knew that simple empathy might not be enough for someone like Adam, who carried such deep-rooted wounds." At the same time, she felt like he wanted her to listen, like he was somehow searching for someone who could understand what he'd never had the courage to share. "Adam, no one can be perfect all the time, and you don't have to carry everything alone," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Sometimes trying to be perfect just takes us away from everything that really matters." He looked at her with a mixture of surprise and a vulnerability she had never seen before. For the first time, it was as if he allowed her to see the side of him that he hid from the world. Julia felt a new closeness, a connection that didn't rely on words but conveyed a mutual understanding, a kind of silent acceptance. They were silent for a few minutes, but that silence seemed to comfort him in a way that no amount of talk or advice could achieve. Finally, Adam took a deep breath, breaking that moment with a weak smile, as if he himself had been surprised that he had shared so much. "I don't think I've ever told anyone that. You have a strange ability to make me talk too much," he said, with an almost genuine smile, but one that still carried the sadness of his past. Julia smiled back, feeling that, little by little, perhaps she was helping him see that he could let his guard down without losing his own strength. He knew this was something that would take time, but maybe this small step forward would be a first step towards something bigger, something that could help him find some peace with the past. And as long as he was willing to open up, Julia would be by his side, even if silently, ready to support him. The next day, Adam felt lighter, as if sharing those memories had relieved some of the burden he was carrying. Julia noticed small changes in his behavior. A slight smile when she approached, a gentler touch when passing a document, or calling her to discuss an issue. Although he remained focused and determined, she knew that, little by little, he was allowing himself to be more human, closer. It was as if, little by little, he was discovering that he didn't need to be an insurmountable fortress to have value. Julia didn't mention the previous night's conversation again, but she felt that something important had changed between them. That shared vulnerability was a constant reminder that beneath all of Adam's control and rigidity was a scarred soul that was still capable of feeling and opening up, as long as he was with the right person. And secretly, Julia hoped he would see her as that person. When they returned to the office after the trip, she noticed that Adam seemed to maintain this new attitude, a more attentive presence, not only at work, but also towards her. He watched her more often, as if recognizing her importance in his life. Julia felt the impact of this closeness, because now, more than ever, she knew that he was also by her side, not just as a boss, but as someone who truly understood her. Over time, this connection strengthened, although silent and veiled. She realized that he allowed her to cross barriers that no one had ever been able to, and in some way, Julia's presence helped him face his old wounds. Adam was becoming, little by little, more than just a powerful, unattainable figure. He was becoming someone she cared deeply about. As Adam's past unfolded in layers and their relationship transformed, Julia realized that, in the midst of her own struggles, she had found a reason to be strong by his side. Adam was a man with flaws and scars, but above all, he was someone who, like her, needed support and understanding. And as their journey intertwined, Julia felt that she was perhaps the first person willing to be by his side, without judgment, accepting him exactly as he was. Night was falling when Julia finally left the office after another long day of work. With her mind still full of worries about Max's custody hearing, she headed to the parking lot. The sound of her footsteps echoed in the almost deserted place, and the feeling of being alone bothered her more than usual. A shadow a few meters away caught his attention. Before she could react, a tall hooded man advanced on her, blocking her path. Julia stepped back, but he was faster, holding her arm tightly. "Julia Carter, right?" His voice was low and threatening, and Julia realized the weight of that threat. He held her arm so tightly that she couldn't let go, and fear quickly dominated her mind. Julia tried to remain calm, but the man's tone was alarming. He seemed to know very well who she was and what was going on in her life, because as he approached, he murmured, "Leave Ethan alone. Stop causing trouble, or it will get worse for you." With growing panic, Julia tried to fight, pushing him with all her strength. In a last-ditch effort, he managed to scream for help, and the sound of his scream echoed through the parking lot, drawing the attention of two employees who were still leaving the building. Upon realizing that other people were approaching, the man abruptly released Julia and quickly left in the opposite direction, disappearing into the shadows. Stunned, Julia felt her legs weaken. One of her colleagues helped her to get up while she was breathing hard, her body shaking and her mind confused. There was no doubt that the attack was planned, a clear warning that someone was out to intimidate her. And Ethan's name, mentioned so coldly, made her heart beat even faster. As she was taken back to the office to compose herself, a single question echoed in her mind. How far would he be willing to go? Upon learning what had happened, Adam immediately came to her. The expression of concern he rarely showed was clear, and upon seeing Julia's hand still trembling, he approached her without hesitation, touching her shoulder with a gesture of unexpected protection. "Julia, what happened? Who did this?" he asked, and the tone in his voice was lower and more intense, as if with each word he was fighting his own anger. Still a little in shock, Julia told what had happened. With each detail he related, Adam's expression became harder, his eyes fixed on her, as if he were determined to resolve the situation at any cost. At the end of the story, Adam was silent for a moment, but Julia saw the determination in his eyes. "Julia, this cannot continue. I will not allow you and Max to be exposed to that kind of danger," he said, in a calm but firm tone of voice. "I will provide security for you and Max, and I want you both to stay at my house until this is resolved." Julia looked at him, surprised. The idea of going to Adam's house, of being under the same roof as him in such an intimate situation, made her nervous. But Max's safety was her priority. She knew she had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. In less than an hour, Adam had coordinated security and organized everything so that Max could be taken safely to his home. Julia was still processing the decision when he guided her to her car, always attentive, ensuring that no one else threatened her. The walk to Adam's house was silent, and she felt torn between the relief of being protected and the strange sensation of exposing herself emotionally in an environment that didn't belong to her. When they arrived at his house, Julia was impressed by the grandeur and modernity of the place. It was a large residence, decorated with impeccable taste, every detail reflecting Adam's reserved and disciplined personality. Upon entering, she was greeted with unexpected kindness. The house, although elegant and organized, felt welcoming, with each room prepared with attention. Max was already there, and when he saw his mother, he ran to her, hugging her tightly. Julia returned the hug, breathing a sigh of relief knowing he was safe. Adam watched the scene from a distance, a soft expression on his face, and Julia realized how hard he had worked to provide a peaceful environment for them. There was an understated tenderness in every protective gesture he showed, and for the first time, Julia felt that she really wasn't alone. "You two are safe here," Adam said, approaching. "And I will do my best to make you feel at home. I know it's not easy, but this is temporary until we can make sure you're out of harm's way." Julia nodded, feeling grateful. She watched him carefully and saw that, despite being the usual demanding and controlling boss, Adam was trying hard to make her comfortable. And that touched her more than she wanted to admit. The barriers that always stood between them seemed to be crumbling, as she could see, more and more clearly, the side of Adam that he hid from the world. During that night, Julia tried to sleep, but the images of the attack still disturbed her. After some time, he decided to go down to the living room, looking for some peace. To his surprise, he found Adam sitting on the couch, lost in thought. Upon seeing her, he invited her to join him, offering her a hot drink. Julia accepted, and the comfortable silence that followed made her feel calmer. "I know it seems crazy to be here, in your house, and that maybe it's a problem for you," said Julia, finally breaking the silence. Adam looked at her, his face serious, but his eyes revealing a rare lightness. "Julia, it's no problem. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make sure you and Max are safe. And honestly, having you here is something I'm starting to value more than I thought," he replied, with a slight smile. The comment caught Julia off guard, and she looked away, feeling a sudden vulnerability. Something between them seemed to have changed. Adim wasn't just the demanding boss. He had become someone she could trust. Someone who, despite all the conflicts, showed genuine concern for her and her son. "I don't know how to thank you, Adam," she said, her voice a little choked. "I know I was resistant to accepting your help, but knowing that you are by our side has made all the difference." Adam nodded silently, and she noticed a sparkle in his eyes, as if he understood perfectly what she wanted to say, without the need for words. For a moment, the space between them seemed to disappear, and Julia felt that their shared environment was creating a deeper and deeper bond. In the following days, the routine at Adam's house became more familiar. Max, always curious and full of energy, explored every corner, and Adam was surprisingly attentive to the boy. At various times, Julia watched them together, and the image of Adam interacting with Max was something she had never imagined. He was patient, welcoming, and seemed to genuinely care about Max's presence, as if somehow that interaction fulfilled something inside him. Each night, while Max fell asleep in a room next to hers, Julia went down to the living room, where Adam was waiting for her, and there they shared increasingly personal conversations. She opened up about the insecurities and fears that came with the custody process, and Adam shared parts of his life that she would never have imagined. He told stories of his lonely childhood, his parents' estrangement, and the pressure he always faced to become who he was. Julia realized that, beneath all the coldness he displayed, there was a man who also felt alone. Someone who had learned to build high walls to protect himself. These conversations became a refuge for both of us. As time went by, Julia realized that she was beginning to open up in a way she had never allowed herself to. She didn't need to be strong all the time. Adim was by her side, paying attention to every detail, offering the kind of support she always wanted, but never had the courage to ask for. The walls she had built around herself began to crumble, and with that, her feelings for Adam gained strength. She felt torn, but at the same time enveloped by an attraction that was becoming difficult to ignore. One night, after one of these conversations that lasted into the early hours of the morning, Adam accompanied her to the hallway. As they said goodbye, he hesitated for a moment, his gaze fixed on hers. Julia felt her heart accelerate, and for a moment, it seemed as if everything around her had disappeared, leaving only the silence that surrounded them. "Julia, I just want you to know that I'm here for you, not just out of obligation," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm here because you matter to me." She was speechless, feeling that those words carried a weight that went beyond what he said. Their eyes met once again, and before she could move away, Adam touched her hand lightly, as if he wanted to convey everything he felt without needing anything else. Julia didn't back down. For the first time, she let herself stay, feeling that she was safe there with him. That night, Julia slept with a feeling of peace that she had not experienced in a long time. She knew that challenges were still ahead of her, but at that moment, she felt that, With Adam by her side, nothing could truly threaten her. Mornings at Adam's house were becoming surprisingly natural for Julia. What had started as a temporary safety measure turned into a routine where she, Adam, and Max shared moments that went far beyond what either of them could have imagined. Adam, who previously seemed completely absorbed by work and his own reclusive life, spent more and more time interacting with Max, and their bond seemed to grow spontaneously and genuinely. Julia used to wake up early, but she would often find Max already sitting at the table with Adam, both laughing or engaged in some conversation that left her son visibly fascinated. One morning, she came downstairs and saw Max proudly explaining how a board game worked, and Adam, to her surprise, seemed completely attentive and interested. Something she would never expect to see from a CEO who was always so focused and meticulous. It was almost unbelievable that he was able to dedicate time to such simple things. But every day, Julia realized that Max was opening a new door in him, a door that perhaps Adam never knew existed. Adam also began adapting his routine to include Max and Julia in activities he would never have considered before. Little by little, the security tension and fear that had hovered since the attack began to be replaced by moments of lightness. One Sunday, Adam suggested that they spend the day outside in a park where he used to run when he needed to unwind. Julia accepted, and soon the three of them were outdoors, walking among the trees and breathing the fresh air of a peaceful morning. Max, happy to be outdoors and with so much energy to burn, ran ahead, calling them to see each discovery he made along the way. The bond between Adam and Max became more visible every day, and Julia watched in silence, touched by their unexpected closeness. Adam wasn't the paternal type, and yet he seemed to deal with Max with a patience and ease that Julia had never witnessed. It wasn't just the attention he gave the boy. There was something instinctive about the way Adam treated him, as if deep down, Max represented a connection to something he never had. And that made her wonder if behind his apparent resistance to emotional involvement, Adam was discovering a side of himself that had remained dormant for a long time. During one of these walks, Max got tired and, as he always did with Julia, raised his arm so someone could pick him up. Before she could react, Adam lifted him with ease, carrying him on his shoulders with an almost awkward but genuine smile. Max laughed loudly, feeling on high, and Julia noticed that Adam looked truly happy, relaxed in a way she had never imagined. It was at that moment that, for the first time, an image formed in her mind, that of a life shared with Adam, where that type of joy and complicity was a constant, where perhaps Max could have the type of masculine figure that I had never thought of offering it. But as quickly as that thought came, Julia felt the weight of reality. Adim was a complex man, with barriers and responsibilities that kept him distant. The fear that this was all just a phase, that he would end up getting tired of her and Max, made her mentally retreat, putting herself on alert. I knew that, for him, that interaction was temporary, a help in a time of need. I didn't want to get attached to an idea that, deep down, might just be an illusion. When they returned home, Adam prepared an impromptu dinner, and as was his custom, he made sure to play soft music while he cooked. Max was visibly excited, helping Adam choose ingredients and prepare some simple dishes, while Julia watched, torn between the desire to give herself to that life and the fear of ending up hurting herself. The truth was that she found herself increasingly trapped by the charisma and security that Adam conveyed, and the idea of walking away from him when the time came terrified her. After dinner, Max was already drowsy, and Julia took him to the bedroom. When he returned to the living room, he found Adam cleaning the kitchen, which in itself was a curious and charming image. He seemed to notice her hesitation when he saw her standing in the doorway, but he smiled with a warm, almost encouraging expression. "Do you want a coffee?" he asked, pointing to the machine as he finished putting away some utensils. Julia nodded and approached, accepting the cup he offered her. They were silent for a moment, but it was a comfortable silence, as if they were both aware of the depth of that moment without needing to verbalize it. Julia took a sip, trying to contain the turmoil of feelings that were rising to the surface. I never imagined seeing you so close to someone, especially Max," she said finally, her voice hesitant but sincere. He really seems to have found a friend in you. Adam watched her, and a gentle gleam came into his eyes. I didn't expect it to be like that either, he confessed, in a tone that seemed almost shy. Something unusual for someone so sure of himself. Max, he has this energy that's hard to resist, and maybe I never realized how much I missed something like that. In fact, I'm discovering that some things can be simpler than I imagined. Those words touched Julia deeply. She felt him opening up, revealing parts of himself that he had always kept hidden. But, at the same time, that moment was full of uncertainty, and she couldn't allow herself to create unrealistic expectations. Adam noticed the hesitation on her face, and as if understanding her thoughts, took a step towards her, his gaze soft but determined. "Julia, I know this may all seem out of the ordinary, even to me, but the truth is, being with you and Max is unlike anything I've ever experienced. I know I've made mistakes. I was insensitive when you needed support. But I want you to know that I'm really here, and not just to protect you, but because it matters to me." She was silent, absorbing every word, but fear and doubt still prevented her from responding. Adam, sensing her internal struggle, didn't press. He just took her hand in a gentle gesture, as if to say he was there to wait as long as necessary. Julia felt a mix of relief and anxiety, aware that she was letting herself go, but unable to resist the sincere affection he was showing. That night, as Julia fell asleep, she was overcome with a feeling of hope and fear at the same time. There was something palpable between her and Adam, something that grew more intense every day. But the uncertainty still kept her wary. Deep down, she knew that with Adam, she was discovering a new perspective on what it meant to trust, on what family could be. The days that followed were like a dream, a routine that reminded Julia how light, peaceful life could be, next to someone who completed her in ways she couldn't even imagine. Adam was increasingly attentive, always willing to offer the support she needed, but without invading her decisions or taking away the control she valued so much. And his affection for Max seemed to grow naturally, without pressure or demands, just a genuine connection. On one such night, as Julia watched Max sleep, Adam approached, placing a hand on her shoulder and smiling reassuringly. His presence by her side, the way he respected her space and at the same time made her feel safe, was something she had never experienced. Looking at him, Julia had the distinct feeling that maybe he was the person she and Max needed. Maybe he was the one who could be the family she always wanted, but never had the courage to seek. However, insecurity still haunted his thoughts. Julia feared that this was all just a phase, a temporary illusion created by proximity and circumstances. What if, in the end, Adam decided that this life wasn't for him? What if, upon realizing the weight of a commitment to her and Max, he walked away, leaving them more vulnerable than before? That night, as she fell asleep with these thoughts, Julia wondered if it would be possible to overcome this fear and allow Adam to become a permanent part of her life. I knew that opening up completely could be risky, but I was also beginning to realize that, perhaps, some people were capable of overcoming any barrier to be with the ones they love. And with that thought, he fell asleep, wishing that what he felt for Adam was not an illusion, but rather the beginning of something true and lasting. It was an ordinary early afternoon when Adam received an unexpected call. As he looked at the unfamiliar number on the screen, he hesitated before answering, but something made him feel like he should listen to whoever was on the other end. When he answered, Ethan's familiar but cold and threatening voice echoed over the line. Adam immediately tensed. "Adam Grayson," Ethan began, with calculated calm, "it's a pleasure talking to you. I imagine you've already heard my name, and I hope you understand how important this call can be." Adam kept his voice steady, but his stomach dropped. He knew well the type of man Ethan was, and was willing to face any threat to protect Julia and Max. Still, the controlled, almost casual way in which Ethan spoke worried him, as if he were about to pull a card up his sleeve that he himself didn't even know was in play. "Let's get straight to the point, Ethan. What do you want?" Adam cut in, his voice cold, keeping his tone firm so as not to show any sign of fear. On the other end of the line, Ethan laughed, a laugh filled with irony and disdain. "I want what I always wanted, Adam, Max, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to achieve that, he replied, with grim certainty. Now, don't think I'm just going to accept your interference without fighting back. I know more about you than you think, and if you continue to help Julia, you may end up suffering the consequences of your own secrets. Adam held his breath. Ethan's tone was menacing, and the implication that he knew something about her past sounded like a dangerous and precise jab. Before he could react, Ethan continued, "By the way, Adam, it would be a shame if Julia discovered certain truths about you, things you'd rather keep in the past, perhaps." The insinuation was clear and punctual, but before Adam could demand explanations, Ethan ended the call, leaving an uncomfortable feeling of threat in the air. With the call ended, Adam remained still, staring into space, trying to process what he had just heard. He knew exactly what Ethan was referring to, but the idea that someone like him could have access to something so personal and painful disturbed him. There were moments from his past that Adam had kept under lock and key, memories that he had never revealed to anyone, and he knew that if this information came to light, it could not only affect him but also compromise Julia and Max's emotional safety, something he was not willing to allow. Determined to resolve everything without alarming them, Adam decided not to mention anything to Julia. She already faced enough with the custody process, and she didn't want to add to her worries. However, the weight of that threat was hard to ignore, and he began to feel more and more withdrawn, as if Ethan's shadow was everywhere, watching, waiting for the right moment to destabilize him. In the following days, Julia noticed that Adam seemed more distant, worried about something he insisted on keeping hidden. Before so present, always attentive and open towards her and Max, now he had become more closed, as if an invisible wall had risen between them. There were times when, even though he was next to her, Adam seemed oblivious, lost in thoughts he avoided sharing. Julia noticed his discomfort, and although she wanted to ask, she was afraid to pressure him, fearing that he would move further away. "Adam, is everything okay?" she asked one night, while the two were in the living room, in another one of those heavy silences that had become frequent. He looked at her, his rigid expression softening slightly, but his gaze still distant. For a moment, he seemed about to say something, as if he was searching for the right words. However, Adam just nodded, looking away. "It's okay, Julia, just some work stuff. Nothing you need to worry about," he replied, trying to sound convincing. But his insincerity showed through, and Julia knew he was hiding something. Even without an answer, Julia felt that that secret was pressing on him in a profound way. Her sixth sense told her that there was more there than he let on, and as much as she tried to respect his space, she couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. She wanted to support him as he had always done with her, but Adam seemed determined to keep her away from that problem, and the distance between them grew every day. The situation got worse when, one afternoon, Julia received a threatening message which seemed to want to intimidate her. The message was anonymous, but Julia knew something was wrong. Nervously, she went to show it to Adam, hoping that he, as always, would calm her down and suggest a solution. However, instead of the protective and caring reaction she expected, Adam read the message with a restrained expression and simply said, "Don't worry, Julia. I'll take care of it." She felt a pang of frustration. Adam, who had previously insisted on resolving everything alongside her, now seemed determined to keep everything silent, as if he were dealing with the problem alone, without including her. It was as if he suddenly believed he needed to take matters into his own hands. This behavior made her question the trust they had built up until then, and insecurity began to infiltrate her heart, making her fear that perhaps Adam was tired of dealing with her difficulties. During the following weeks, tension increased. The previously peaceful nights and deep conversations had been replaced by formal exchanges and a silence that Julia didn't know how to break. Frustration and resentment grew, and she found herself increasingly wondering if it all really mattered to him. She missed Adam's support, the man who had helped her overcome her own barriers, and more, that Adam seemed to distance himself, as if he were behind an invisible barrier. In a moment of venting, Julia decided to confront him. One silent night, after Max was already asleep, she entered the room where Adam was, and Gathering all the courage she could, approached, determined to demand an explanation. "Adam, I know something is happening. I won't pretend I don't understand. You are distant, evasive. You are not the same man who helped me fight for what I love most. Please tell me what's going on. I deserve to know." Adam looked at her, and for a moment, he seemed torn between the desire to speak and the fear of exposing something he preferred to leave hidden. He looked down, taking a deep breath before responding, but the weight of his words seemed to crush him. "Julia, it's not that I don't trust you. Just, there are things in my past that are complicated. Things that I tried to leave behind and that now someone is threatening to use against me. I don't want to involve you in this. I don't want Max or you to suffer for something that shouldn't even be part of my life anymore." She watched him, feeling the pain underlying those words. I knew Adam had always been reserved, but this was different. He was trying to carry her alone, perhaps for fear of losing the image of strength he had always conveyed. However, for Julia, that omission was a blow. She felt excluded from an important part of his life, like she wasn't worthy of knowing what was really going on. "Adam, I understand that you have parts of your past that you would prefer to forget, but we all do. I have mine myself. If we're in this together, it's important that you trust me, just as I trust you." Walking away only makes everything more difficult. He looked at her, and his eyes reflected the internal battle he was waging. It was clear that he wanted to protect her, but at the same time, he realized that his attempt to keep her out of this problem was putting everything they had built at risk. However, even with Julia's words, he hesitated, unable to take the definitive step of opening up completely. "Julia, he began, but his voice trailed off, and he just looked away. The pain and frustration showed on his face, but he seemed powerless to overcome them. Julia realized that as long as he didn't allow himself to face his past, as long as he didn't trust her fully, perhaps that relationship would remain on hold, trapped by fears he wasn't yet ready to let go of. With a heavy heart, Julia walked away, giving him the space he clearly needed. But feeling the bond between them weakening every day, he kept that secret silent. That morning, Adam made a decision he had been putting off for days. After Ethan's call, it became clear to him that keeping Julia and Max by his side only increased the risks for them. He knew there were dangers he could never explain to Julia, threats he would rather face alone. The past was closing in on him in an inescapable way, and the only way to protect it was to walk away. He entered the room where Julia was reviewing some documents, and, seeing her so concentrated, he felt a stab of pain in his chest. He watched her for a moment, realizing how used he was to having her around, hearing her share ideas, and especially seeing her smile genuinely, something that had become rare for both of them in recent weeks. However, that bond that united them, built with so much effort, now pressed on him in an almost unbearable way. With a heavy heart, he approached her, his voice low and controlled. "Julia, I need to talk to you," he said, in a tone that seemed more formal than he intended. Julia looked up, confused by his posture, but straightened up, realizing that something important was about to be said. Adam hesitated for a second, but continued, gathering the strength to say what he knew was necessary. "I think it's best that you and Max go back to your house. I'll keep you safe, of course, but it's best if we stay away for a while." The words hung in the air, and Julia needed a moment to process them. At first, the surprise left her unresponsive, but soon a wave of disbelief and indignation took over her. Since Ethan had reappeared, their relationship had already been shaky, but the idea that Adam might just walk away and cut all ties hit her like a cruel low blow. "Are you saying you want me and Max to go home?" she asked, her voice low, but full of pain and disappointment. "Why? I thought we were in this together, Adam. You yourself promised that you would be by our side." Adam held her gaze, but the look of pain in her eyes disarmed him. "I wanted to be able to explain everything, tell her about the dark past that Ethan threatened to expose. But I knew that revealing that part of his life would only bring more suffering and uncertainty to Julia and Max." "Julia, this is for your own good," he replied, with a clear effort to keep his tone controlled. "I can't risk anything happening to you or Max. You're too important. And I need to figure some things out on my own. Julia felt her chest tighten and tears threatened to surface, but she held them back, lifting her chin with determination. With every word he said, she felt betrayed, as if all the trust she had placed in him was undone. It seemed unbelievable that Adam, who until recently had promised to protect her and Max at any cost, was now sending her away. So that's it? Are you willing to abandon us because you decided it's what's best for us? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I thought we were partners in this, Adam, that Max and I meant something to you. Julia's words went through Adam like a blade, but he didn't let the pain show. He knew he was cruel, that his silence sounded like an indifference he didn't feel, but he was determined to protect Julia and Max at any cost, even if it meant being seen as a coward. They mean, Julia. You mean everything to me, he replied, in a serious tone, but with a weight in each word. And that's exactly why I'm doing this. I can't put you and Max in danger. I need you to trust me and move forward. But trusting was the last thing Julia could do at that moment. Disappointment brimmed in his eyes, and she felt as if a wall of ice had risen between them, a chasm that seemed insurmountable. Looking away, she took a deep breath and gave a small nod of her head, without the strength to argue or insist. Very good, Adam. If that's what you want, we'll go. She left the room without looking back, but felt the crushing weight of rejection. Somehow, Adam had managed to destroy the security she thought she found with him. The feeling that they finally had something real, and now everything seemed like an illusion, as if the moments they shared were nothing more than an empty promise. The next day, Julia and Max returned home. The abrupt change in Adam's coldness had shaken her deeply, and as she tried to adjust to the new reality, her heart closed more and more. The nights seemed endless, and every corner of her house, once a refuge, now brought back memories of the days of security and affection she had lived with Adam. At work, she avoided any mention of him, remaining focused on her tasks and avoiding showing the suffering that consumed her. Max, in turn, felt Adam's absence in a way that Julia couldn't explain. The boy asked about him almost every day, wanting to know why they weren't together anymore, why Adam had stopped being the warm, protective presence he had become. Julia, not knowing how to explain, tried to distract him with excuses about the work routine, but the weight of Adam's absence hung over them inescapably. The void left by Adam affected Julia's daily life in a subtle but intense way. She avoided places and habits that reminded her of the moments they had shared. But the truth was that any attempt to move on felt artificial. At work, the mere mention of Adam's name made her feel a pang in her chest, a pain that seemed to deepen every time she saw him from afar. Passing through the corridors, always serious and distant, he seemed focused, but Julia knew that, behind that facade, something was also affecting him. The weight of longing and separation made each day more unbearable. Adam, on the other hand, tried his best to maintain his routine, but the impact of Julia and Max's separation was immense. Each night, the silence of his home seemed more oppressive. He was returning to a space that had once been so orderly and peaceful, but now seemed empty, almost desolate without Max's laughter or Julia's welcoming presence. He wished he could go back and explain everything to her, but he knew that would be the same as exposing them to a danger that he would rather face alone. Despite the decision I had made, I couldn't stop thinking about Julia and Max. With every unsent message and every call she considered, she felt the conflict rising within her. Sometimes he picked up the phone, about to write to Julia, but decided against it, convinced he was doing the right thing by keeping his distance. It was a suffering he would rather endure than see them in danger because of their past. The days turned into weeks, and the pain of absence deepened. Missing Julia became something almost physical, and every memory of her seemed alive in his mind, insistent, as if his own home was permeated with her presence. Every corner, every nighttime silence brought him the weight of an emptiness he had never felt before. Max also appeared in his memories, and Adam found himself smiling to himself when thinking about the boy's laugh, the incessant questions, and the way he filled the house in a unique way. Julia, in turn, tried to rebuild the emotional barriers that had broken down with Adam. She avoided all contact, but she couldn't stop her heart from racing whenever she saw him or heard his name. She knew that trying to forget him was the safest path, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something essential had been taken from her. Something she wanted in a way she had never experienced. The pain of loss was a wound that seemed to never heal. Max, not understanding what had really happened, asked increasingly sad questions about Adam. Julia tried to comfort him, but she felt the pain and absence as intensely as he did. Adam had become someone important to both of them, and the void left by his departure seemed impossible to fill. And so, amid silence and longing, Julia found herself increasingly trapped in memories that, although precious, left her suffocated by the fear of never being able to relive them again. The discovery of the truth about Adam came to Julia unexpectedly, like a breath of revelation she never knew she needed. He was organizing some papers in the office when he overheard a conversation between colleagues who mentioned Ethan's name and something about blackmail. Intrigued, she approached discreetly, trying to better understand what they were saying. "I heard he found something about Adam, something serious from his past, and he's using it against him," said one of the assistants, lowering her tone to make sure no one else heard. "Yes, it seems that Ethan threatened to tell everything, and that's why Adam had to stay away from Julia. He is being pressured in a horrible way," added the colleague. With a worried look, Julia felt her heart race when she heard those words. In an instant, everything made sense: the sudden departure, the coldness he'd shown when sending her back home with Max, the blank, lost look she'd noticed from him in the last few weeks. The truth was that Adam had distanced himself to protect her, sacrificing how they felt for each other to keep her safe. The thought left her stunned and at the same time hurt her deeply. Adam had made the decision alone, without even trusting her enough to share what was happening. The feeling of anger and pain grew inside her, and the need to confront him became inevitable. Without thinking twice, Julia left the office and went to Adam's house, determined to demand answers and clarify everything he had hidden. Upon arriving at his house, Julia hesitated for a moment. The place's imposing facade now seemed more like a reflection of the emotional barrier Adam had erected between them. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions she felt. After a few seconds, Adam answered, and the look of surprise and vulnerability on his face made her realize he hadn't expected to see her there. "Julia," he began, but the intensity of her gaze made him stop. "No, Adam, I don't want to hear explanations now. I already know what Ethan did. I know he's using something against you. What I don't understand is why you decided to keep me in the dark, why you chose to push me away instead of trusting me." Her voice was filled with pain, but also with an indignation that he couldn't ignore. Adam looked down, clearly embarrassed and hesitant. There was an internal struggle within him, but Julia needed him to be honest, to finally say what she so desperately wanted to hear. "Julia, I just wanted to protect you and Max," he began, his voice hoarse and lower than normal. "Ethan discovered something from my past that I never wanted to come to light. These are things that no one knows, that I preferred to bury, and he threatened to expose everything if I stayed by his side. He would use any means to hurt her, and I couldn't allow that. I couldn't bear to see you or Max pay for the consequences of my mistakes." With every word, Julia felt the intensity of Adam's pain and regret, but she also realized how much he had underestimated their relationship, how much he had believed that by pushing her away, he would protect her without her having a choice. She felt betrayed, but also touched by the vulnerability he finally revealed. "Do you think protecting means pushing me away?" she asked, her voice trembling but determined. "Adam, I trusted you. I opened my heart. I let Max get close to you. And then suddenly you decide that you can just decide everything yourself, without even giving me the chance to choose to be by your side." He fell silent, her words hitting him with a force he hadn't anticipated. Adam knew he had made a mistake, that he had made a decision without consulting her, without respecting the bond they had built. The decision to push her away had been his, and his alone, and he now understood how much it had hurt her. "I'm sorry, Julia. The last thing I wanted was to hurt you," he murmured, finally raising his eyes to look at her. "I thought it would be easier this way, that if I walked away, Ethan would give up." But now I see that my decision only brought suffering to all of us. For me, for you, and especially for Max. The look of vulnerability in his eyes disarmed her, and Julia realized that the pain she felt was shared. However, the disappointment was still intense, and she knew that forgiveness would not come so easily. "Do you have any idea what Max and I have been through the last few weeks?" she asked, her voice breaking. "He asked about you every day, Adam, and I didn't know what to answer. I found myself wondering if everything between us was just a mistake, a fantasy that you thought you could end whenever you wanted." Adam approached, his expression filled with regret, and held her hands gently. The intensity of his touch, mixed with the guilt and desire for reconciliation in his eyes, made her shudder. "Julia, nothing between us was a mistake. Every moment by your side was real. It was more than I ever imagined feeling, and I was a coward for believing I could make that decision alone. I was scared of losing everything, but it seems like that's exactly what I ended up doing." She kept her gaze fixed on him, trying to absorb the sincerity of his words. But resentment and insecurity still throbbed in her chest. "I knew his love was real, but I also knew that I needed more than words to overcome the pain. Adam, I don't know if I can just ignore everything we've been through these past few weeks," she said, finally letting go of his hands. "I don't know if I can trust someone who thinks the best way to protect me is to keep me in the dark, to walk away when things get difficult." He nodded, understanding the impact his actions had made. As much as he wanted to beg for a second chance, he knew it would be unfair to pressure her into forgiving him so easily. He needed to earn her trust again, rebuild what he had destroyed with his own decisions. "I understand, Julia. I can't expect you to forgive me now, but please believe me when I say that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn your trust back, to prove that I really can be someone you and Max can trust." Julia looked away, trying to contain the tears that threatened to fall. There was something painfully true in his words, but also a nagging fear that he might break her heart again. "Adam, I need time. I need to understand what I really want for me and Max. I don't want you to be in our lives only when it's convenient. I need to know that I can count on you. And that will only happen if you trust me the same way you expect me to trust you." He nodded, knowing she was right. It wouldn't be easy to regain her trust, but he was willing to try, to truly open up and allow her to know all the parts of his past that still haunted him. He felt like this was his last chance, a chance he couldn't let slip away. "I'll wait as long as necessary, Julia. How I feel about you and Max, that won't change. And this time, I'm ready to fight, to face anything by your side." She looked at him for a long moment, seeing the sincerity in his eyes, and felt that maybe, just maybe, it would be possible to rebuild what had been destroyed. But the road would be long, and she knew she would need strength to believe in him again. The doubt was still there, as was the fear, but there was also a spark of hope, a small light that perhaps, in the future, could rekindle the love they once shared. The job offer came to Julia unexpectedly, as a promising opportunity to start over in a new city. It was a position with more stability and a good growth perspective, exactly what she always wanted to guarantee a better future for Max. When she saw the email with the proposal in her inbox, she felt a mix of enthusiasm and relief. Maybe it was exactly what she needed to leave the past behind and focus on a new phase of her life, away from the conflicts and memories that Adam still provoked in her. However, as he read the details of the job and the changing conditions, Adam's name lingered in his mind like a shadow that was impossible to ignore. The recent conversation between them, the promise that he would try to regain her trust and overcome his own fears, left her torn. A part of her wanted to take the job and leave, believing that a fresh start in a different city was best for her and Max. The other part, quieter but equally intense, wondered if she really was ready to leave Adam for good, without giving him the chance to prove that he had changed. During that week, the proposal occupied his thoughts, and even though he tried to avoid the decision, he knew that he would soon have to choose between a new life and a possible fresh start with Adam. Every time Max smiled or asked him about Adam, the dilemma intensified. He was getting used to being away, but Julia realized that Adam's absence was affecting her son. Max fondly mentioned the times they spent together and spoke of Adam with an admiration and affection that she didn't know how to replace. When she finally found the courage to tell Adam about the offer, he was visibly shaken. When he heard her explain the proposal and mention the idea of starting over in a new city, his expression changed, as if he was trying to absorb the impact of that decision. After everything they had been through, the possibility of Julia leaving hit him like a deep and unexpected pain. "So that's it? Are you decided to leave?" he asked, his voice low, but filled with intense emotion. Julia hesitated, trying to organize her feelings. As much as she wanted to remain firm, she felt that when she talked about leaving, something inside her was also breaking. "I haven't completely decided yet," she said, avoiding looking at him directly. "But this opportunity seems like a chance to have a more stable life. Max needs this. I need this. I cannot ignore what is being offered. Maybe it's what we really need to move forward." Adam approached, his eyes fixed on her, pain visible in every feature of his face. He understood Julia's need to protect Max and seek stability, but the thought of losing her consumed him. He tried to control himself, but he couldn't stop his voice from betraying the desperation he felt. "Julia, you have every right to seek a new life, but I believe that we still have a chance, that we can build something solid together. I know I've made mistakes, big mistakes, but I'm willing to open up completely, to be the man you and Max can trust. I want to be there for you. I want to be part of Max's life. And most of all, I want you to see me as someone worth having around." She looked at him, feeling the intensity of his words like an echo inside her. He was really willing to change. She could see that. However, the scars of what he had done, the sudden separation, and the pain she had carried in the last few months were still too present to ignore. "Adam, I don't know if it's that simple. So many things happened. You made decisions on your own. You pushed me away. And I don't know if I can go through that again. If things get complicated, I don't know if you'll be willing to deal with them by my side, without pushing me away again. I need to think about Max and what's best for us. And this offer represents everything I ever wanted for him." Adam nodded, taking a deep breath, trying to absorb the weight of her words. He knew her confidence was shaken, that promises of change might not be enough to undo what he had destroyed. But at the same time, he couldn't resign himself to the idea of seeing her go. He came closer, his gaze determined, and held her hand softly, trying to convey the sincerity he felt. "I understand, Julia, and I won't ask you to forget what I did. But I know that I am capable of being a different man, of facing everything by your side, for real. You and Max are what make me want to be someone better. And if you give me a chance, I will prove that you can trust me, that I can be by your side, no matter how difficult it is." Julia felt her heart divided between rationality and desire. The sincerity in his eyes made her want to believe, made her want to find a way to move past the past and give him a chance to be a part of her life and Max's. But the fear ran deep, and the doubts gnawed at her. "Adam, I don't know if I can fully trust you again. I don't want Max to get more attached to you just for you to leave him one day. And more than that, I don't know if I can take that risk again." Adam seemed to understand the depth of her dilemma, and with a sigh, he loosened his grip on her hands, but still kept his gaze steady. "I accept the risk, Julia. Even if you're not ready to give me an answer right now, I want to show you that you can trust me. I'm not going to ask you to choose between this job and us. I just want you to know that I will be here, willing to build something solid, something that none of us need to fear or doubt." His words touched her deeply, and Julia felt tears pooling in her eyes, the pressure of the dilemma threatening to crumble her walls. She knew it wasn't an easy decision, that any choice would bring consequences for her and Max. Adam was offering a future with him, something she always wanted, but now, surrounded by uncertainty and marked by suffering, she was hesitant to give up the fresh start that the new job represented. She looked away, trying to contain the emotion that threatened to overflow. She took a deep breath, absorbing everything he had said, and felt that she still needed time, a space to think clearly. "Adam, I need a few days. I need to reflect on all of this. It's an important decision, and I don't want to make it hastily." He nodded, though the pain in his eyes was undeniable. She knew her time was fair, and that respecting this process was essential to any possibility of reconciliation. "I understand, Julia, and I'll be here waiting, whatever you choose." Over the next few days, Julia devoted herself to thinking deeply about the future she wanted for herself and Max. The job offer was a valuable opportunity, and Adam's distancing seemed promising to prevent her and Max from getting hurt again. However, her longing for him was constant, and with each passing moment, it was impossible not to imagine what their life would be like if she allowed Adam to be part of it. He had been the first man to truly care, to love them, and the bond Max had built with him weighed on his decision. Indecision accompanied her every thought. At night, as she watched Max sleep, she felt an aching need to provide her son with the security and love he so deserved. And it made her wonder if she was depriving him of a figure he truly loved. If Adam could truly change, if he could keep his word, maybe she should at least try to give them a chance, a family. Finally, on a cloudy afternoon, Julia decided to meet Adam to give her answer. She knew that the decision she would make would forever change the course of their lives. As I walked towards his office, I felt my heart racing and a mix of nervousness and hope. As she entered, she saw Adam sitting, his expression filled with anxiety, but also with a determined calm, as if he were ready to accept whatever her choice was. "Julia," he began, but she raised her hand, asking him to let her speak. "Adam, after thinking a lot, I realize that I can't ignore what you represent to me and Max, but I also can't forget the pain and mistrust that your removal caused. If we're going to try again, I need to know that I can count on you, that you won't walk away when things get tough." Adam nodded, his gaze fixed on hers, and slowly approached her. "I promise, Julia, I won't leave you alone ever again." 1820th. Declaration of love. Adam felt his heart race as he prepared to open the most vulnerable side of himself. Julia's presence, there in front of him, made him realize how much she meant to him, and that this was his last chance to be completely honest. Watching her with eyes full of intensity and courage, he took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what he needed to say. "Julia, I know that asking you to stay by my side is risky, especially after everything I've done. I know my decision to walk away was a mistake," he began, his voice low and full of emotion. "But if you agree to listen, I want to tell you everything. I want you to know every part of me, including the parts I'm ashamed of." She watched him, intrigued by the honesty he showed and the vulnerable look in his eyes that she had never seen before. Adam, who had always been so secure, so closed off in his own pain, seemed finally willing to expose the wounds that tormented him. "I walked away because I'm afraid of being a burden to you," he continued, his voice hesitant. "Since I lost my mother and had to deal with a distant father, I've always found myself alone. I learned to solve everything on my own, without expecting anything from anyone. And that made me believe that I wouldn't be able to truly give myself, that it would be better to keep people at a distance, so as not to hurt them and not be hurt." Julia absorbed every word, and the depth of what he said touched her intensely. Adam carried deep wounds, fears that made him even more human, and she began to understand that, behind all that strong posture, there was a man marked by loneliness. "But being with you changed me, Julia. With you and Max, I learned to feel things I never thought I would feel," he said, and a slight hesitation took over his expression. "You are everything to me. I see in you what I always looked for, what I never believed I would have. And that scares me, but it also makes me want to be the man you deserve." Julia felt torn between the pain of what he had done and the intensity with which he spoke. With each word, Adam seemed more sincere, more willing to break down all the barriers that separated him from her. But her fear was still palpable, and the fear of suffering again, mixed with the desire to believe in the promise of a future together. "Adam, this isn't easy for me," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "I know that what we feel is real, but I also know how much it hurts when you decide to push me away. I don't know if I can deal with this uncertainty. I don't know if I'm ready to open my heart again, knowing that I could end up suffering again." He looked at her, understanding the pain and hesitation she carried, and took a step towards her, closing the distance between them. Adam knew he couldn't force anything, but he was determined to show he was willing to fight. "Julia, I promise I won't run away again. I promise that I will be by your side, that no matter what happens, I will face everything with you, he said, holding her hands with a soft but firm touch. I know I can't erase what happened, but I can prove that I've changed, that I'm here, ready to be by your side, to be someone you can trust. Julia felt the tears come, and this time she didn't hold them back. Adam's words were full of emotion and regret, and she saw in his eyes a genuine feeling, a promise that, for the first time, seemed solid. Still, the fear persisted. Adam, I want to believe in you. I want to believe that we are capable of building something together. But what if it doesn't work? What if one day you realize that this is too much for you? The insecurity showed in his voice, and he, understanding every fear, held her face with both hands, fixing her gaze with intensity. Julia, listen to what I'm going to say. I love you. I love you in a way I never thought I could love anyone. And I won't give up on this. I won't give up on us. No matter what happens, I'll be here. I will face my fears and my failures, because I know that you and Max are all I need to live fully. The statement left him vulnerable, but he didn't look away. Julia saw the sincerity in his eyes, the firmness with which he took every word, and her heart began to give way, still hesitant, but more open to the possibility of a new beginning. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her doubts lifting, albeit slowly. Adam, I love you too, she admitted, her voice almost a whisper. But this love won't be enough if we're not really committed. I can't accept this without being sure that we will face everything together, that there will be no more secrets. He nodded, his hands still holding her face, and a slight, almost relieved smile appeared on his face. I promise, Julia. I won't hide. I will no longer let the past separate us. I am willing to face every mistake and every shadow, as long as I am by your side. I just need you to trust me. The tension between them was reaching its peak, but at the same time, Julia felt that something between them was resolving, solidifying in a way she had never experienced. The decision to be with Adam was difficult and fraught with risk, but looking at him, feeling the sincerity in every word and every gesture, she knew she was ready to try. I'll try, Adam, but I need you to know that it will be a difficult path, and I will need you at every step, she said, her gaze firm, but full of hope. He nodded, finally allowing himself to smile, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for since he met her. Without hesitation, he pulled her into a hug, holding her against him as if he feared that she might disappear at any moment. Julia felt the heat of his body and allowed herself to relax, letting love and hope speak louder than fear. At that moment, they didn't need anything else. In the days following her intense conversation with Adam, Julia found herself caught between two equally strong choices. On the one hand, the job offer represented the stability she had always sought for Max and herself, an opportunity to move away from the risks and pain that her connection with Adam had brought in the past. On the other hand, I felt that, with him, I found something that went beyond security, a true presence, and a love that I had never experienced. Even so, the decision seemed impossible, and the only certainty I had was that, in any case, I would be giving up something essential. Max, oblivious to his mother's dilemmas, was excited about the idea of a new city. Julia had talked to him about the possibility of moving, and the boy had accepted the idea with the typical enthusiasm of a child, mentioning the new things he could see and the friends he hoped to meet. But whenever Max asked about Adam and whether Uncle Adam could visit, Julia felt a twinge of doubt. I wanted Max to have a chance at a peaceful childhood, but I also knew that his bond with Adam was real and special. He realized, now more than ever, that he was about to make a choice that would change their fate. Finally, with her heart still divided, Julia chose to accept the proposal and make the change, convinced that it was the most sensible choice. Even if it meant leaving Adam behind, she had to prioritize the future that was already before her. And after days of doubts and tears, the decision materialized when he signed the transfer contract. She spent the night awake, lost among confused feelings, but she remained firm, determined to move forward. On the day of the move, Adam found out about the departure from a brief message from Julia. Her words were direct, avoiding sentimentality, as if she feared that any one more word might crumble her decision. The message said that she was grateful for everything they had experienced and wanted him to be happy, but that she needed to leave to provide Max with a better life. Adam read the message several times, feeling the impact of those words and the void they left in his heart. He tried to respond, but every time he started typing, he realized that there weren't enough words to express what he felt. Everything seemed empty without her, and the only certainty was that her life had lost its direction. For Julia, the trip was marked by profound silence. Max, by her side, was talking excitedly about his new adventures, but Julia could barely respond. She felt numb, as if with every kilometer that distanced them from the city, something inside her was fragmenting. As much as she tried to convince herself that she had made the right choice, a part of her constantly questioned her, reminding her of the moments she had shared with Adam, of the promise of a fresh start. The truth was that he had become part of her life in a way that not even distance seemed able to erase. The days in the new city began with a hurried routine full of new things. Julia busied herself with her new job, her responsibilities, and the adjustment process for Max, trying to fill every minute to avoid thinking about what she had left behind. Yet each night, when the house fell silent, Adam's absence became unbearable. He was in every memory, in every smile that Max shared, in the little everyday things that she wanted to share with someone. She missed his presence, his voice, and the security he brought, and this made her realize that the decision to leave was a mistake. Without her realizing it, Adam was still a part of every moment of her life. She spent days reluctantly, trying to convince herself that she could move on, but at the end of each day, she realized that the emptiness inside her was too deep to ignore. Then, on a night when the longing seemed more than she could bear, Julia finally accepted that her feelings for Adam were stronger than her fear of being hurt again. It was a clear and inevitable truth. No matter how much I had tried to run away, I couldn't deny that the love I felt for him was greater than any doubt. Making an impulsive but determined decision, Julia packed her bags again. Max, upon seeing the unexpected movement, was confused but at the same time excited. She explained that they needed to return to the city to resolve some issues, and when she saw the smile on her son's face, she knew she was making the right decision. Within hours, she and Max were on their way, on a journey that seemed to be driven by the strength of her heart, a strength she finally accepted. Upon arriving back in the city, Julia felt her heart beat faster, filled with a mixture of nervousness and expectation. I knew that this reunion would change the course of their lives, but I wasn't sure how Adam would react. Even if he had left, she hoped that he would take her back, that the love between them would be strong enough to withstand this new chance. Finally, upon arriving at Adam's house, Julia hesitated for a moment. The night was silent, and the soft sound of your racing heart seemed to fill the room. Max, by her side, held her hand, and she felt that it gave her the strength she needed. She rang the doorbell, and after a few seconds of silence, the door opened, revealing Adam, whose expression went from surprise to intense emotion when he saw her there. "Julia," he murmured, as if he couldn't believe what he saw. She smiled, feeling tears welling up in her eyes, but her voice was firm. "Adam, I realized I was making a mistake leaving. I tried to walk away, I tried to move on, but I realized that you are part of my life in a way that I can't just ignore. I came back because you're what I really want, because we are a family, and I can't give up on that." Adam watched her, his eyes shining, and his expression of relief and happiness was undeniable. He walked over, taking her hand tenderly, and then bent down to greet Max, who hugged him with a happy smile. "I knew you'd come back," said Max, with an innocence that made Julia and Adam exchange an emotional look. Adam stood up, still holding Julia's hand, and without saying anything else, pulled her into a tight hug. She surrendered to that hug, feeling the peace and comfort that she only found by his side. All the doubts that haunted her disappeared in that instant, and all that was left was the deep and genuine feeling they shared. After a few minutes, Adam pulled away just enough to look into her eyes, and in a voice full of emotion, murmured, "I promise you, Julia, that I will make every moment worth it, that I will never let you go again." Julia nodded, knowing that this time they were both ready to face whatever came together. With the trust and love they had built, stronger than any fear. Months had passed since Julia and Adam's reunion, and their lives had taken a turn that, before they had only imagined in their wildest dreams. The decision to stay together, to not run away from the feelings they had, brought a relief and peace that previously seemed impossible. Julia felt at home next to Adam, as if all the obstacles and uncertainties had only served to reinforce the certainty that, together, they could face any challenge. Over time, Adam dedicated himself to building a solid relationship with Max, fulfilling the promise he made to Julia to be a man she and her son could trust. Adam discovered every day what it meant to be a father figure, someone Max could lean on, share secrets with, and seek advice from. He took this responsibility seriously and caringly, and Max responded with a love and trust that warmed Adam's heart in a way he had never experienced. Being important to Max, being a constant presence in his life, was one of Adam's greatest accomplishments, something he had come to value above all else. Their house, now full of life and movement, was always full of laughter and small conversations at the end of the day when everyone gathered for dinner. It was a moment that Julia and Adam were keen to preserve. No matter how busy they were, they always sat at the table with Max, talking about the day, laughing at his stories and sharing plans for the future. Adam had discovered that these small rituals, once insignificant to him, had become what he valued most about his routine. Julia, in turn, felt complete and safe. Adam was now her partner in every way, someone with whom she shared her joys and concerns, who understood her desires and offered the support she had sought so much. Max, who at first feared the idea of losing that new life, was the one who adapted best to the new reality. He felt protected like never before, and now he had the security of a stable family, a safe haven where he knew he would always find love and support. The boy, who had once been more shy and insecure, flourished with the constant and attentive presence of Adam, who with patience and tenderness encouraged him to be courageous and self-confident. Their relationship, one of complicity and affection, grew every day, and Julia felt grateful and happy to see her son finally living with the joy and care he deserved. One night, after putting Max to bed, Julia and Adam sat on the porch. The soft light of the moon illuminated the garden, and the peaceful silence of the night enveloped them. Julia rested her head on Adam's shoulder, feeling completely at peace. It was as if every moment of difficulty they experienced was necessary for them to get there, so they could truly appreciate the love they had built. "Sometimes I still wonder if all this is real," Julia murmured, looking at the stars. "We've been through so much, and yet, here we are, together, in a way I never thought possible." Adam hugged her tighter, smiling with affection and a lightness that was now part of who he was next to her. He finally felt complete, accepting the love he once feared, but which was now his greatest strength. "I think about that too, Julia," he replied, with a soft tone. "But I learned that you and Max are my reality, my true family, and I will do everything I can to make sure that never changes. Thank you for coming back, for believing that we could still be happy together." Julia smiled, and when she looked into his eyes, she felt even more connected to the man she now knew in all his facets. Adam was no longer just the powerful and reserved boss he had known, nor the tormented man he had once feared to love. He was now her life partner, someone willing to share not only the moments of joy, but also the difficulties, challenges, and achievements that the future would hold for them. In the months that followed, their lives continued to be filled with shared moments. Adam and Julia learned to share the work and responsibilities of raising Max, and in the midst of this routine, they found a true sense of family. One morning, Adam walked Max to school, one of the activities he made a point of doing whenever work allowed. Seeing him walk alongside Max, talking and laughing, Julia felt her heart overflow with gratitude. It was clear that Adam had fulfilled his promise to be a father figure to Max, and the joy of his son, with someone who loved him so much, was one of the greatest blessings she could have. Max grew up with the certainty that he was loved and protected, and this transformed him day by day into a confident and happy boy. When someone asked him about Adam, he didn't hesitate to call him father, with a pride and affection that made Julia emotional. Adam, in turn, reciprocated with all his love and dedication, grateful to have found such a precious purpose. Julia and Adam's lives strengthened over time, and their love, now based on trust and understanding, blossomed more each day. The wounds of the past, once so present, had turned into memories, into lessons that united them even more deeply. They knew that, together, they were capable of overcoming any challenge, and that the bond between them and Max was the foundation of everything they built. Months later, on a special night, Adam organized a dinner at home with a light and affectionate atmosphere, and in front of Julia and Max, he did something that left her surprised and moved. With a deep look and a sincere smile, he knelt down and, holding her hand, declared once again how much he loved her, asking them to officially become a family. Julia, thrilled, accepted without hesitation, and Max, upon seeing the scene, jumped with joy, hugging them both with an enthusiasm that made Julia laugh and cry at the same time. From that moment on, the lives of the three became even more united, a journey of love and companionship. Adam, Julia, and Max finally formed the family they always wanted, based on everything they had learned together: trust, sincerity, and above all, the love that would overcome any obstacle that might arise.